By the 5th century BCE, Greek authors began referring to a land beyond the cold edges of the inhabited world, a region described as both inaccessible and enduring, where daylight stretched unnaturally and seasonal rhythms differed from the familiar Mediterranean cycle. Archaeological evidence from northern Eurasia suggests that early populations living in extreme latitudes adapted to shifting climatic patterns long before these descriptions were recorded, creating environmental contexts that may have informed distant cultural memories. Meanwhile, textual analysis of Herodotus, Pindar, and Hecataeus reveals that accounts of the Hyperboreans emerged during a period when Greek geographical knowledge expanded through trade, colonization, and contact with Scythian and Arctic-adjacent groups. This convergence of environmental data, historical linguistics, and narrative motifs suggests that Hyperborea functioned not as a literal polity, but as a conceptual boundary marking the limits of known space and the possibilities of human adaptation. A single image remains striking: the imagined light falling across a northern horizon, shaped in Greek thought by real atmospheric phenomena observed at subpolar latitudes. The significance of Hyperborea lies not in its physical certainty, but in the way it reflects early attempts to integrate myth, geography, and ethnography into a coherent model of the world. Continue as we examine how climate, culture, and cross-cultural memory shaped one of antiquity's most persistent northern imaginaries. By the early centuries of Greek intellectual development, the world's northern boundary existed not as a physical frontier, but as a conceptual threshold drawn from fragments of travel reports, shifting climatic intuitions, and inherited cosmological patterns. The region identified as Hyperborea stood beyond settled cartographies, positioned at the margin where speculation began to fill the gaps left by incomplete geographic knowledge. Archaeological evidence from habitation sites across northern Fennoscandia and the White Sea Basin indicates that human communities adapted to demanding subarctic environments as early as the 7th millennium BCE, forming seasonal patterns of movement shaped by caribou migration, coastal resource cycles, and variations in early Holocene climate. Meanwhile, Greek thinkers such as Hecataeus of Miletus worked with maps that compressed the Eurasian continent into familiar radial models, placing unknown territories into schematic outlines based on climate theory rather than observation. This combination of empirical lacunae and environmental reasoning created a cognitive space where reports from distant traders could easily become transformed into images of lands marked by unusual light, stable abundance, or ritual order. A faint sensory detail, like the low horizon glow recorded in later Greek descriptions, recalls natural atmospheric effects near the Arctic Circle, where twilight stretches across extended durations during summer months. The persistence of such details across textual traditions implies the movement of northern information through intermediary populations linking the Pontic steppe to Mediterranean centers. Stratigraphic data from Mesolithic layers in the Varangia Peninsula and the Kola region illustrate the long-term presence of foraging groups who exploited marine mammals, fish, and migratory birds using composite tools crafted from slate, bone, and antler. These findings demonstrate material continuity that aligns with broader patterns visible across northern Eurasia, where populations adjusted to environmental constraints through flexible subsistence systems. Greek authors, although lacking direct contact with such groups, received secondary descriptions filtered through intermediary Scythian communities whose own geographical range extended deep into the northern forest steppe. Herodotus records encounters with peoples whose lands stretched into colder regions where daylight lengthened and winter constrained movement, suggesting a background of ecological realities that preceded the conceptual formation of Hyperborea. Radiocarbon sequences from peat bogs and lake cores in the region document climatic oscillations that shape the distribution of flora and fauna, affecting the viability of habitation and migration. These environmental conditions provide grounding for understanding why Greek ethnographers perceived the far north as a realm defined by difference. Unusual seasonal light, resilient populations, and landscapes structured by cycles unfamiliar to Mediterranean observers. A conceptual reflection arises from these comparisons, indicating that ancient geographers often projected their own environmental expectations onto distant lands, interpreting deviations not as variations within human adaptability, but as markers of otherness embedded in mythic language. As Greek commercial penetration expanded through the Black Sea during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, the flow of information from the north increased, though rarely with consistency. Traders navigating the Dnieper, Don, and Volga corridors encountered communities with diverse material cultures, many of which left archaeological traces through ceramics, metal ornaments, and portable tools that bear stylistic connections to regions extending toward the Arctic fringe. Excavations at sites in the Upper Volga region and the forest belt reveal artifacts that circulated widely, such as amber beads whose provenance connects them to Baltic sources. These items appear in Greek settlements along the Pontic coast, demonstrating economic exchange across thousands of kilometers. Such long-distance movement of goods also facilitated the transfer of environmental descriptions, many of which likely deteriorated in precision as they passed through multiple linguistic and cultural filters. Linguistic analysis of ethnonyms encountered in Greek texts, names like Aramasp, Isidones, and other northern groups, shows patterns of transformation consistent with exonyms applied by intermediary populations. This mechanism offers a plausible model for how a geographic idea like Hyperborea could crystallize from layered accounts of unfamiliar territories. A conceptual reflection emerges from this process. The ancient world often constructed imagined geographies not through invention, but through the accumulation of partial information shaped by cultural expectation, transforming real northern landscapes into symbolic markers of the world's edge. The combination of climatic data, archaeological distributions, and evolving Greek literary traditions suggests that Hyperborea belonged to a category of spatial concepts designed to articulate the limits of geographic comprehension. Its significance lies not in physical verification, but in analytical insight into how ancient societies conceptualized distance, climate, and cultural difference. Through this lens, Hyperborea becomes a methodological case study for understanding how early scientific thought negotiated the tension between empirical data and inherited narrative structures. The chapter closes on a quiet transition. As the boundaries of Greek geographical knowledge expanded, the idea of Hyperborea shifted, shaped by new encounters and older cosmologies that framed the northern world as both reachable and remote, both real and interpretive. The gradual refinement of Greek geographical thought during the classical period occurred alongside expanding intellectual attempts to categorize the world according to climatic zones, a framework that placed exceptional emphasis on latitude as a determinant of human character and environmental conditions. Greek theorists such as Parmenides proposed early models distinguishing temperate, torrid, and frigid belts, imagining the far north as an area where solar angles created elongated days and compressed nights. Archaeological evidence from boreal and subarctic habitation sites along the Pechora and lower Ob rivers demonstrates that real populations living at these latitudes developed adaptive strategies in response to precisely these astronomical patterns, coordinating seasonal activities with lengthy periods of daylight or darkness. Pollen core data from lakes in the Komi Republic reveal periodic expansions of birch and pine forests during warm intervals of the Middle Holocene, supporting higher resource density and allowing occupational stability for millennia. Meanwhile, Greek sailors encountering travelers from Scythian markets would have heard fragmented descriptions rooted in these ecological realities, though reframed through conceptual lenses more familiar to Mediterranean thought. One imagines the muted crunch of snow underfoot during distant northern winters, preserved in travel lore that later evolved into abstract ethnographic detail. Herodotus' account of the Isidones and Arimaspe reflects a narrative layering process in which Greek authors wove together geographical information with moral and symbolic motifs drawn from their cultural repertoire. Excavations at early Iron Age settlements in the Kazim and Sosva basins show ceremonial practices involving metal ornaments, animal remains, and carved bone objects, which indicate social complexity but do not align with the idyllic stability assigned to Hyperborea in Greek literature. Radiocarbon dating of hearths and habitation layers places these communities squarely within recognizable cultural sequences, reinforcing that Greek descriptions of northern peoples often blended empirical observation with conventions derived from poetic and philosophical traditions. The contrast between archaeological material and textual representation serves as evidence for how ancient ethnography merged fact with interpretive expression, constructing images of distant societies shaped as much by ideological concerns as by observed phenomena. A conceptual reflection arises. When ancient writers described the margins of the world, they often sought not geographic accuracy but intellectual coherence, arranging distant communities into patterns that affirmed broader theories about climate, virtue, or cosmic order. The persistence of Hyperborea as a geographic motif suggests that certain narrative elements resonated with deeper Greek concerns regarding the relationship between environment and social harmony. Pindar's characterization of the Hyperboreans emphasizes prosperity, ritual propriety, and longevity, attributes that correspond to an ideological model of a community unaffected by political turmoil or agricultural scarcity. Archaeobotanical studies from Neolithic sites in northern Norway and Finland indicate that populations relied on mixed strategies of fishing, hunting, and seasonal gathering, providing nutritional stability even during colder periods. While these subsistence systems bear no direct connection to Greek ideals, the environmental consistency of northern ecosystems may have filtered indirectly into southern imagination through accounts emphasizing abundance and endurance. Amber routes linking Baltic shores to the Aegean facilitated contact between regions with markedly different ecological profiles, creating opportunities for selective interpretation in the transmission of northern descriptions. A conceptual reflection notes that Hyperborea, rather than referring to a specific people, represents the projection of a stable environmental niche onto a mythic canvas, illustrating the human tendency to anchor idealized societies in remote landscapes where empirical contradiction seems improbable. As Greek geographical models improved through the incorporation of data gathered by explorers such as Pytheas of Massalia, the northern world became partially demystified. Pytheas' account of Thule, though fragmentary, is one of the earliest Greek attempts to describe environments close to the Arctic Circle based on first-hand observation. His references to a region where the sea, land, and air intermingle in a gelatinous mixture likely refer to sea ice or slush observed during transitional seasons, phenomena later misunderstood or doubted by contemporaries who found such conditions incompatible with Mediterranean experience. Sediment cores from the Norwegian Sea corroborate the presence of seasonal ice conditions during the late Iron Age, supporting the plausibility of Pytheas' report. Yet his observations did not erase earlier notions of Hyperborea. Instead, they coexisted with inherited narratives, producing a layered conceptual geography in which empirical and symbolic descriptions occupied parallel roles. A conceptual reflection considers how ancient intellectual traditions maintained multiple, sometimes contradictory models of distant regions, allowing mythical frameworks to persist even as scientific understanding advanced. These overlapping streams of information, archaeological, climatological, textual, demonstrate how Hyperborea functioned as a boundary marker within ancient Greek thought, a symbolic north that delineated the limits of human knowledge. The chapter approaches its transition point by acknowledging that the next phase of inquiry must focus not on reconstructing a lost civilization, but on examining the literary processes that formed the Hyperborean motif itself, situating it within the broader evolution of Greek ethnography and cultural memory. By the later classical period, the conceptual role of Hyperborea expanded as Greek scholars attempted to integrate earlier mythic geography with increasingly systematic observations of the natural world. The incorporation of climatic theory into geographical models encouraged the belief that extreme northern regions possessed environmental characteristics capable of shaping distinctive social structures. Archaeological sequences from the forest-tundra zone north of the Kama and Vichegda rivers demonstrate long-term continuities in settlement behavior, with recurring patterns of seasonal mobility adapted to fluctuating resource fields. Stable isotope analysis of faunal remains recovered from these sites indicates consistent dependence on migratory species, reinforcing the idea that subsistence strategies in the far north derived from an intimate awareness of cyclical environmental change. Meanwhile, Greek authors filtered distant northern descriptions through a Mediterranean interpretive frame that associated environmental constancy with social equilibrium. This divergence between empirical data and literary representation illustrates the selective processes by which ancient cultures interpreted unfamiliar spaces. A sensory detail, such as the soft resonance of waves beneath fractured sea ice, adds texture to the ecological settings that once informed accounts passed along steppe trade routes. The circulation of northern materials into the Mediterranean provides additional evidence for indirect cultural exchange that may have contributed to the elaboration of Hyperborean imagery. Excavations at Baltic coastal sites, particularly those associated with the Narva and Combe ceramic cultures, reveal extensive production of bone tools, amber artifacts, and pottery with distinctive textile impressions. Chemical sourcing of amber beads found in Mycenaean and later archaic Greek contexts confirms their origin in the southern Baltic, demonstrating north-to-south transfer networks active across multiple millennia. These routes likely conveyed not only material goods, but also fragmented descriptions of distant landscapes, shaped by intermediaries whose linguistic and cultural frameworks differed significantly from Greek conceptual categories. The archaeological visibility of these objects contrasts with the invisibility of the voices that carried their stories, yet the persistence of northern motifs in Greek literature suggests that such transmissions contributed to the narrative foundations of Hyperborea. A conceptual reflection arises from this disparity. Ancient geographies often depend on the survival of textual traditions rather than the full complexity of interactions, highlighting how limited evidence can generate expansive mythic structures that endure in collective memory. Herodotus' skepticism regarding earlier reports of northern marvels demonstrates the fluid nature of geographic belief in antiquity. Although he rejected certain mythical descriptions, his own account nonetheless incorporates ethnographic elements that blend plausible observations with stylized narrative conventions. Radiocarbon analysis at burial mounds across the Middle Ural region reveals mortuary practices involving red ochre, stone settings, and complex arrangements of grave goods, providing cultural detail that resonates faintly with ritual themes embedded in Greek references to northern peoples. Yet none of these findings supports the existence of a society exhibiting the utopian stability attributed to Hyperborea. Instead, the archaeological record illustrates variability, adaptation, and social differentiation, common features of human communities across all latitudes. The contrast underscores how Greek ethnographers used northern imagery to articulate philosophical ideas about moderation, ritual propriety, and cosmic balance, projecting their ideals onto distant landscapes where verification was unlikely. A conceptual reflection follows. Hyperborea's endurance as an intellectual motif reveals how ancient societies used imagined geographies to explore questions about the ideal organization of human life. Later Hellenistic scholars attempted to reconcile earlier mythic accounts with more systematic geographical frameworks. Diodorus Siculus synthesized diverse traditions by situating Hyperborea near the Riphean Mountains, whose existence remained speculative but symbolically useful as a northern boundary. Geological evidence from the Ural Range, often associated in ancient thought with distant mountains marking the edge of the world, shows long-standing human activity, including metallurgical production dating to the Bronze Age. These real landscapes, though far removed from Greek experience, possessed environmental features, dense forests, extended winters, and uneven daylight cycles that could easily have informed southern imaginings through indirect transmission. The textual harmonization undertaken by Hellenistic authors suggests an intellectual transition. Hyperborea no longer functions solely as a poetic construct, but became an interpretive category used to organize diverse geographic data. A conceptual reflection highlights how such reinterpretations demonstrate the adaptive capacity of mythic frameworks when confronted with expanding empirical knowledge. As the conceptual geography of the ancient world approached greater coherence, Hyperborea retained its position not as a defined place, but as a boundary image representing the transition from known to unknown. Its significance in Greek intellectual history derives from its function as a test case for understanding how ancient societies processed information about remote environments, merging empirical observation with inherited narrative forms. The chapter concludes with a quiet shift toward the next phase of inquiry, the need to trace how Greek literary traditions codified and elaborated these northern motifs, transforming scattered descriptions into a structured ethnographic theme. This progression leads directly into the examination of Greek textual sources and the formation of the Hyperborean motif in classical thought. The emergence of Hyperborea within Greek ethnographic thought occurred through a gradual accumulation of textual references that blended distant geographical information with literary conventions inherited from archaic poetry. By the 6th century BCE, Greek authors had begun experimenting with systematic approaches to describing foreign peoples, yet their access to northern data remained mediated through multiple layers of transmission. Excavations at early Iron Age sites in the northern Pontic region reveal a diverse cultural landscape composed of Scythian, forest steppe, and indigenous forager populations, each maintaining distinct subsistence practices and exchange networks. These communities served as intermediaries in the movement of goods and information toward Greek colonies along the Black Sea, providing the indirect foundation for descriptions later transformed into the mythic imagery of Hyperborea. Meanwhile, textual analysis of Pindar's odes demonstrates an early literary impulse to situate ritual purity and social harmony at the margins of the world, attributing these traits to a northern people whose remoteness insulated them from conflict and decline. A single sensory image, such as sunlight glancing across imagined fields near the edge of the known world, reveals how geographical distance could be reframed into symbolic significance by poets seeking to illustrate moral order. Herodotus represents a crucial stage in the intellectual codification of northern ethnography. Although he frequently questioned the veracity of earlier accounts, he nonetheless incorporated elements that reflected familiar narrative structures, including references to peoples possessing unique customs, unusual lifespans, or access to resources shaped by distinctive environments. Archaeological evidence from the Minusinsk Basin and the Middle Volga region provides detailed records of communities engaged in metallurgy, animal husbandry, and seasonal mobility during the period in which Herodotus wrote. Yet none of these groups match the idyllic qualities attributed to the Hyperboreans. Radiocarbon sequences from habitation layers in these regions reveal fluctuations in settlement density corresponding to climatic shifts, indicating that these societies faced challenges common to human populations across diverse ecological zones. This discrepancy underscores the methodological challenge inherent in interpreting ancient ethnographic texts. Authors often intermixed empirical observation with narrative motifs that expressed ideological concerns rather than geographic accuracy. A conceptual reflection arises from this contrast, demonstrating how ancient writers used distant societies to articulate ideas about moderation, stability, or cosmic order rather than to produce faithful descriptions of remote environments. The specific qualities assigned to the Hyperboreans, longevity, ritual propriety, and harmonious social structure, reflect deeper Greek anxieties regarding disorder and political instability. In Pindar's descriptions, the Hyperboreans inhabit a land untouched by the hardships that characterize human experience elsewhere, a conceptual space where ritual offerings travel across vast distances to reach Delos, the sacred island associated with Apollo. Archaeological investigations at Delos reveal layers of votive deposits, imported ceramics, and ritual architecture spanning the archaic and classical periods, demonstrating the island's central role in Pan-Hellenic religious networks. Although no artifacts directly link Delos with northern Eurasian populations, the symbolic association between the island and distant lands underscores how ritual narratives created imaginative connectivity across vast geographic spaces. Stratigraphic studies of Delian sanctuaries show continuous use over centuries, reinforcing its significance as a focal point for communal identity and myth-making. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that Hyperborea's ritual dimension served not to describe a real cultic partner, but to situate Greek religious practice within a cosmological geography that extended beyond the Mediterranean. Literary analysis of Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, reveals how earlier Hyperborean motifs were reinterpreted within more systematic historiographical frameworks. His synthesis of northern traditions draws from diverse sources, including accounts that positioned Hyperborea near the Riphean Mountains or associated it with lands beyond the North Wind. Geological surveys across the Ural Range, often identified metaphorically with the Riphean Mountains, demonstrate extensive mineral resources and long-standing human habitation, with evidence of copper mining and metallurgical production dating to the Bronze Age. These real landscapes provided plausible anchors for Greek attempts to map mythic geography onto empirical terrain. Yet textual discrepancies among ancient authors reveal an underlying instability in Hyperborea's location and characteristics, suggesting that the concept functioned less as a geographic claim and more as a literary scaffold accommodating shifting intellectual agendas. A conceptual reflection notes that such adaptability reflects the broader dynamics of ancient ethnography, in which narrative patterns persisted even as empirical knowledge expanded. The coexistence of poetic, historiographical, and philosophical traditions illustrates how Hyperborea evolved into a composite ethnographic idea shaped by multiple genres. Greek authors treated northern peoples as interpretive symbols embedded within cosmological debates, ethical discussions, and ritual narratives, rather than as empirical subjects in their own right. This interpretive function explains why Hyperborea remained resistant to geographic verification, even as Greek exploration advanced into the northern Atlantic. The chapter's transition emerges from this observation. The next phase of inquiry must investigate the environmental and astronomical conditions that shaped Greek perceptions of the far north, revealing how climate and cosmic patterns influenced the narrative formation of Hyperborea. The transmission of northern ethnographic motifs into Greek literature depended heavily on the structure of information networks that linked the Aegean to the Eurasian interior. Greek colonies along the Pontic coast, such as Olbia and Panticapaeum, served as primary nodes of cultural exchange, where merchants, diplomats, and itinerant specialists encountered steppe intermediaries who possessed knowledge of regions far beyond Greek horizons. Excavations at these colonial centers reveal substantial volumes of imported goods, including Scythian metalwork, stamped amphorae, and locally adapted pottery forms, demonstrating sustained cross-cultural interaction. These material traces indicate that Greek encounters with northern descriptions were not rare events, but ongoing processes shaped by economic necessity and shifting geopolitical alliances. Meanwhile, oral accounts transmitted through multilingual trade zones introduced Greek listeners to narratives concerning extended daylight, severe winters, and migratory animal patterns, features consistent with archaeological and paleoclimatic data from northern Eurasia. A sensory detail, such as distant reports of rivers freezing thick enough to permit overland travel, conveys environmental conditions that later solidified into the geographic aura surrounding Hyperborea. The ethnographic elements embedded in Greek sources reflect a selective process in which unfamiliar customs were reorganized according to prevailing intellectual frameworks. Herodotus' reliance on comparative models, contrasting known practices with those reported from distant peoples, illustrates how Greek ethnographers used variability to comment on universal human behaviors. Archaeological evidence from mortuary complexes across the forest steppe zone, including kurgans with elaborate grave goods and evidence of feasting rituals, provides context for understanding these descriptions. Radiocarbon analysis and stable isotope studies indicate dietary patterns emphasizing mixed pastoral and hunting economies, aligning with environmental constraints typical of continental climates. However, the structural consistency of these societies contrasts sharply with the utopian attributes assigned to the Hyperboreans, revealing that Greek authors imposed moral significance onto distant populations as part of broader philosophical narratives. A conceptual reflection follows. When ancient writers incorporated ethnographic detail, they often embedded it within interpretive frameworks shaped by ethical ideals, transforming empirical fragments into symbolic representations of human possibility. The literary evolution of Hyperborea demonstrates how narrative motifs migrate across genres. In archaic poetry, Hyperborea functioned as a realm of ritual perfection. In classical historiography, it became a test case for evaluating the credibility of distant reports. And in philosophical texts, it served as an anchor for reflections on environmental determinism and the limits of human habitation. Analysis of manuscript traditions reveals that Hyperborean descriptions circulated widely, undergoing subtle modifications as scribes, commentators, and later scholars reinterpreted earlier sources. The presence of these motifs across centuries suggests that Hyperborea operated as a flexible conceptual space capable of sustaining diverse intellectual applications. Archaeological surveys of northern Eurasia provide robust cultural sequences for real populations, yet none exhibit the static harmony attributed to Hyperborea, reinforcing the conclusion that Greek authors shaped the motif according to internal literary logic rather than external observation. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that imagined geographies persist because they satisfy cognitive and cultural needs, offering stable points of reference within expanding maps of the world. Trade routes connecting the Baltic, steppe, and Mediterranean regions offer a plausible mechanism for the long-distance transmission of ritual narratives that later contributed to the Hyperborean myth. Amber beads, copper ingots, and finely crafted bone objects found in Greek and Scythian contexts indicate that symbolic materials moved alongside utilitarian goods. Excavations at sites associated with the Trz and Lusatian cultures demonstrate participation in exchange networks reaching into southeastern Europe, suggesting indirect pathways by which Greek authors encountered northern ritual concepts. Although material culture does not directly attest to Hyperborean offerings, the circulation of exotic objects supported narrative elaborations that assigned sacred significance to distant lands. Linguistic studies of Indo-European ritual terminology show parallels in vocabulary associated with offerings and seasonal festivals, though these correlations do not establish direct links to Greek descriptions of Hyperborean cults. A conceptual reflection arises. Ancient authors often interpreted intercultural exchange through the lens of religious meaning, attributing sacred purpose to objects whose origins lay beyond familiar cultural boundaries. The convergence of archaeology, textual analysis, and environmental data demonstrates that Greek ethnography of the far north relied on a dynamic interplay between empirical fragments and ideological construction. Hyperborea, rather than representing a literal society, became a conceptual framework through which Greek thinkers organized information about unfamiliar regions. Its enduring appeal reflects the role of imagined geographies in shaping ancient intellectual landscapes, providing structured ways to articulate ideas about climate, ritual, and social order. This understanding leads naturally into the next stage of inquiry, in which environmental and astronomical factors will be examined to determine how perceptions of the far north influenced the development of the Hyperborean motif. The consolidation of Hyperborea as a recurring ethnographic element in Greek intellectual traditions illustrates how ancient writers negotiated the tension between empirical knowledge and inherited narrative forms. By the 4th century BCE, the expansion of Greek exploration and the accumulation of geographical observations did not eliminate earlier motifs. Instead, they created an environment in which mythic descriptions coexisted with emerging scientific frameworks. Archaeological surveys across the lower Don and Dnieper basins reveal substantial cultural complexity during this period, marked by fortified settlements, specialized craft production, and diverse ritual practices. These findings contextualize the populations most likely to have transmitted northern information southward, though the archaeological record provides no evidence for communities matching the idealized attributes assigned to the Hyperboreans. Stratigraphic data from these regions show shifting patterns of habitation consistent with climatic variability, emphasizing the adaptability rather than the stability of local societies. Meanwhile, Greek authors continued to associate the far north with ritual propriety and harmonious existence, indicating that Hyperborea functioned primarily as a conceptual tool rather than a geographic report. A sensory detail, the faint crack of frost beneath migrating herds, evokes environmental rhythms that shape the distant landscapes Greeks imagined but never directly observed. The durability of Hyperborean imagery owes much to the structure of Greek literary discourse, which relied on inherited themes to construct meaning around geographic uncertainties. In poetry, Hyperborea served as a rhetorical space where perfection could be projected without fear of contradiction. In historiography, it functioned as a testing ground for evaluating the reliability of distant reports. And in philosophical texts, it provided an example for discussions about climate, virtue, and cosmic balance. Analysis of scholia on Pindar and Herodotus reveals that later commentators often expanded Hyperborean references by incorporating details drawn from unrelated traditions, demonstrating how textual transmission contributed to the motif's evolution. This cumulative process produced increasingly abstract representations that further distanced Hyperborea from any historical referent. Archaeological data from the Eurasian taiga and tundra regions underscore this divergence. Stable isotope profiles of human remains from Mesolithic and Neolithic contexts indicate diverse diets anchored in fishing, hunting, and seasonal gathering, with no evidence for the static abundance depicted in Greek accounts. A conceptual reflection arises from this comparison. Ancient ethnography often reveals more about the culture producing the narrative than about the populations it claims to describe. The intellectual momentum of Greek ethnography ensured that Hyperborea remained embedded within broader conversations about geography, climate, and human diversity. Philosophers interested in environmental determinism frequently invoked northern peoples as examples to illustrate how climatic extremes influenced social structures and moral dispositions. Although these discussions were rarely grounded in empirical observation, they reflect a growing attempt to integrate environmental theory with cultural description. Paleoclimatic reconstructions from ice cores and lake sediment analyses reveal substantial changes in temperature, precipitation, and vegetation across northern Eurasia throughout the Holocene, offering scientific context for understanding the ecological realities that shaped distant communities. These data contrast sharply with Greek portrayals of Hyperborea as a region of perpetual harmony, yet they highlight the degree to which ancient intellectual systems sought stability in conceptual models even when confronted with environmental variability. A conceptual reflection follows. Human cultures frequently impose order on unfamiliar spaces by aligning them with internal philosophical ideals, transforming geographical distance into symbolic meaning. The accumulation of Hyperborean imagery across centuries created a durable conceptual geography that persisted even as Greek understanding of the world expanded through exploration and scientific inquiry. The motif's adaptability made it a useful tool for writers seeking to illustrate ideas about virtue, ritual purity, or cosmic alignment. Archaeological surveys across the Ural and Siberian regions provide evidence for long-term cultural continuity, including ritual sites, metallurgical centers, and settlement patterns extending across broad landscapes. Yet these findings confirm the diversity and dynamism of northern societies rather than the static perfection implied in Greek texts. This contrast reinforces the conclusion that Hyperborea was never intended as an empirical description, but as an intellectual construct shaped by the literary and philosophical needs of the culture that created it. A final conceptual reflection closes the chapter. The durability of Hyperborea reveals how imagined geographies function as cognitive anchors, organizing the unknown into forms that reflect cultural identity and intellectual aspiration. The chapter transitions quietly toward the next stage of the investigation, where environmental and astronomical conditions will play a central role. Understanding how climate and cosmic patterns influenced Greek perceptions of the far north provides the foundation for analyzing why Hyperborea acquired such distinctive symbolic power within ancient thought. The conceptual formation of Hyperborea cannot be separated from the environmental and astronomical conditions that shaped ancient Greek attempts to understand the world's extremities. Greek geographical speculation relied heavily on climate theory, which posited that environmental gradients determined both the character of landscapes and the nature of the peoples inhabiting them. The far north, positioned along the boundary between the temperate and frigid zones, became an intellectual canvas upon which unusual celestial and seasonal phenomena were projected. Paleoclimatic reconstructions derived from ice cores in Greenland and pollen sequences across northern Eurasia reveal a dynamic Holocene climate marked by oscillations in temperature and precipitation, producing intervals of ecological stability followed by periods of rapid environmental change. Archaeological evidence from Mesolithic and Neolithic settlements along the Arctic fringe indicates that populations adapted to these fluctuations through flexible subsistence strategies involving coastal fishing, caribou hunting, and the seasonal exploitation of rivers and wetlands. Meanwhile, Greek observers, lacking direct knowledge of these environments, learned of extended daylight, prolonged twilight, and seasonal darkness through intermediary reports, integrating these features into the mythic geography associated with Hyperborea. A single sensory detail, the diffuse glow of a sun lingering near the horizon long past expected dusk, captures the atmospheric context that helped shape Greek interpretations of the northern world. The astronomical dimension of Hyperborean imagery reflects Greek efforts to reconcile observational astronomy with inherited cosmological traditions. Early thinkers such as Parmenides theorized about the structure of the inhabited zone based on the Earth's spherical form and axial inclination, proposing that polar regions experienced extreme variations in light and temperature. Although Greek astronomers had no instruments capable of measuring polar phenomena directly, they extrapolated from mathematical models and accounts attributed to distant travelers. Excavations at Bronze Age sites across northern Norway and Finland reveal alignments in stone settings and horizon markers that suggest awareness of solar cycles, though their chronological and cultural contexts differ significantly from Greek traditions. These findings demonstrate that ancient northern populations developed sophisticated systems for tracking seasonal change long before Greek theorists speculated about the far north. Yet when such information entered Greek thought through indirect channels, it was reframed within symbolic narratives that emphasized harmony and cosmic balance. Stratigraphic data from multiple Arctic sites show sustained habitation despite climatic fluctuations, contradicting Greek assumptions that extreme latitudes were inhospitable to stable human life. A conceptual reflection emerges. Ancient geographical imagination often transformed ecological resilience into symbolic perfection, attributing ideal conditions to regions whose environmental realities were poorly understood. The integration of northern astronomical features into Greek literature illustrates how scientific reasoning and mythic narrative coexisted in antiquity. Descriptions of perpetual daylight, muted sun paths, and elongated seasons appear in texts that combine observational detail with speculative geography. Although the specifics of these reports remain difficult to verify, they correspond to real polar phenomena documented in modern climatological studies. Sediment cores from lakes across the Kola Peninsula provide evidence for temperature fluctuations that altered the timing of plant growth and animal migration, creating ecological rhythms distinct from those familiar to Mediterranean observers. These patterns may have filtered into Greek consciousness through steppe intermediaries whose seasonal practices, including long-distance migrations and winter encampments, reflected environmental conditions shaped by northern climate. However, Greek authors did not attempt to reconstruct these ecological systems. Instead, they employed celestial irregularities to distinguish Hyperborea from the known world, portraying it as a region where environmental and cosmic order aligned in ways that conferred harmony upon its inhabitants. A conceptual reflection follows. For ancient thinkers, astronomical anomalies served not merely as empirical data, but as narrative devices that articulated the boundaries of human experience and the structure of the cosmos. The chapter approaches its transition point by acknowledging that the environmental and astronomical foundations of Hyperborean imagery formed only one layer of its conceptual development. The next phase of inquiry must examine how Greek interpretations intersected with deeper historical processes, including Indo-European myth structures and the cultural memory of long-distance migrations, which further influenced the evolution of the Hyperborean motif. The environmental realities of northern Eurasia offered a complex backdrop, against which Greek interpretations developed. Yet the information that reached the Mediterranean world was inevitably filtered through cultural and linguistic intermediaries. Populations inhabiting the subarctic regions of the Kola Peninsula, Karelia, and the Barents Sea coast left archaeological sequences indicating long-term adaptation to fluctuating climatic regimes. Excavations at Mesolithic sites, such as Veritai and the Kuznetsovskaya complex, reveal toolkits composed of polished slate knives, bone harpoons, and composite fishing gear, underscoring the ecological knowledge required to survive in environments governed by extreme seasonal variability. Meanwhile, palynological studies from Lake Kors in northern Russia document alternating phases of forest expansion and contraction across the Holocene, illustrating environmental dynamics wholly unfamiliar to Greek observers. When reports of these conditions traveled southward through successive layers of translation and interpretation, they were reconfigured into the stylized descriptions that came to characterize Hyperborea. A sensory detail, wind sweeping across broad expanses of tundra, carrying the sound with no obstacle to break it, quietly evokes the landscapes from which such narratives may have originated. Greek ethnographers grappled with these northern features by integrating them into broader climatological theories that sought to explain human diversity. The Hippocratic treatise Airs, Waters, Places posited that environment shaped both physiological traits and social customs, establishing a precedent for interpreting distant populations through the lens of environmental determinism. Archaeological evidence from northern Eurasian mortuary contexts, including the rich burial assemblages at Olny Ostrov and the cemeteries of the Taiga Belt, demonstrates a wide range of ritual practices involving ochre, antler carvings, and elaborate grave arrangements. These findings reflect cultural diversity rather than the homogeneity implied in Greek accounts of Hyperborea. Radiocarbon dating of these sites indicates extended occupation periods, challenging assumptions that northern regions were marginal or intermittently inhabited. Yet the Greek tendency to interpret unusual environmental conditions as markers of moral or ritual significance persisted, shaping descriptions that emphasized harmony and longevity. A conceptual reflection follows. Ancient ethnographic frameworks frequently transformed ecological variability into moral categories, aligning distant populations with ideals that reinforced Greek conceptions of cosmic order. Astronomical interpretation played a significant role in sustaining Hyperborea's conceptual distinctiveness. The Greek understanding of solar motion, though increasingly mathematical by the Hellenistic era, remained partly grounded in inherited cosmological narratives that framed extreme latitudes as sites of celestial irregularity. Reports of prolonged daylight and slow-moving suns near the horizon found narrative resonance within Greek philosophical discussions of symmetry, balance, and the natural limits of habitation. Meanwhile, archaeological studies of northern Eurasian stone alignments, including possible solstitial markers in the Karelian region, provide evidence that ancient northern populations developed observational systems attuned to the same celestial patterns that later intrigued Greek thinkers. Stable isotope analysis of animal remains from these areas reveals seasonal mobility patterns consistent with shifts in daylight and temperature, further substantiating the ecological realities that informed distant accounts. Yet Greek writers did not incorporate these details. Instead, they interpreted celestial anomalies as signs of inherent environmental stability, projecting harmony onto landscapes shaped by constant climatic negotiation. A conceptual reflection highlights how astronomical phenomena, when perceived through indirect observation, can become anchors for symbolic systems that extend beyond empirical context. The persistence of Hyperborean imagery reflects the difficulty ancient societies faced in integrating incomplete scientific knowledge with inherited narrative traditions. Although Greek thinkers increasingly employed quantitative reasoning to describe celestial and climatic systems, the absence of direct experience in polar regions limited their ability to evaluate reports from the far north. Geological and paleoclimatic studies demonstrate that northern Eurasia underwent significant transitions during the mid to late Holocene, including the spread of boreal forests, shifts in precipitation patterns, and episodic cooling events documented in ice core oxygen isotope ratios. These data contrast sharply with Greek portrayals of Hyperborea as a region of unchanging abundance. Yet the symbolic resonance of the northern frontier endured precisely because it allowed Greek writers to articulate a vision of cosmic balance situated beyond the constraints of everyday life. The chapter approaches its next thematic turn by acknowledging that environmental and astronomical conditions shaped only part of Hyperborea's intellectual formation. Its deeper significance emerged through cultural memory and mythic structures that extended beyond geographic explanation. The interaction between environmental observation and cosmological speculation shaped the intellectual landscape in which the Hyperborean motif evolved during the late Archaic through Hellenistic periods. Greek thinkers increasingly sought to align geographical knowledge with astronomical principles, using natural phenomena as indicators of the world's structure and the distribution of habitable zones. Reports of extreme northern light cycles, although imprecise in detail, resonated with Greek attempts to conceptualize how the Earth's curvature and axial tilt governed regional climates. Paleoclimatic studies from subarctic Eurasia, including lake sediment records showing shifts in vegetation composition, reveal that the ecological conditions described indirectly through travel lore were grounded in real environmental patterns. Archaeological investigations at coastal sites along the White Sea and northern Norway document specialized adaptations to marine resources, illustrating the resilience of human communities in high-latitude environments. These empirical anchors stand in contrast to the symbolic interpretation that Greek authors imposed on the far north, transforming complex ecological systems into simplified markers of cosmic harmony. A sensory detail rises from this landscape, the muted shimmer of low-angle sunlight reflecting across frozen water, echoing the atmospherics that ancient informants may have struggled to describe. The philosophical integration of Hyperborean imagery became more pronounced as Greek thinkers developed increasingly sophisticated models of climate and celestial mechanics. Aristotle's discussions in the Meteorologica, while largely empirical, nonetheless reflect inherited assumptions about the limits of human habitation and the distribution of temperate zones. Although he refrains from referencing Hyperborea directly, the framework he articulates, linking climate to character and habitability, provided later authors with a conceptual foundation for situating idealized societies in extreme latitudes. Excavations at Bronze and Iron Age sites across Finland and Western Russia reveal evidence of long-term settlement continuity, including pit houses, metalworking areas, and ritual sites marked by stone arrangements. Radiocarbon sequences from these areas demonstrate that populations adapted successfully to climatic variability, contradicting the notion that northern environments were inherently inhospitable or static. Yet Greek interpretations framed these regions as places where cosmic and environmental order coincided, projecting philosophical ideals onto unfamiliar ecological realities. A conceptual reflection follows. Ancient intellectual systems often reconciled environmental diversity with philosophical cohesion by reimagining distant landscapes as embodiments of theoretical balance. The endurance of Hyperborea within Greek intellectual history reflects the narrative power of astronomical irregularities, which offered a compelling means of distinguishing the far north from familiar Mediterranean environments. Prolonged twilight, low solar arcs, and extended seasonal cycles provided natural markers around which stories could crystallize, even when transmitted through fragmented channels. Archaeological evidence from Stone Age alignment sites in the northern Baltic, though culturally distinct from Greek traditions, demonstrates an acute awareness of celestial rhythms among prehistoric populations. These structures, positioned to observe solstitial events or track seasonal transitions, attest to the deep temporal roots of astronomical observation in the region. Stable isotope analysis of human remains from these areas indicates dietary patterns responsive to seasonal cycles, further reinforcing the ecological contexts behind northern accounts. When such information migrated southward, it underwent interpretive compression, re-emerging in Greek literature as signs of a realm where environmental rhythms produced social equilibrium. A conceptual reflection underscores that astronomical phenomena, although objectively observable, become culturally meaningful only through interpretive frameworks that assign them narrative significance. As Greek scholarship matured during the Hellenistic period, the effort to harmonize empirical geography with inherited mythic traditions produced increasingly layered interpretations of Hyperborea. Authors such as Diodorus Siculus attempted to reconcile early poetic descriptions with evolving cartographic models, situating Hyperborea near speculative mountain ranges or framing it as a region beyond the reach of conventional climatic reasoning. The tension between empirical evidence and literary inheritance became more pronounced, demonstrating how ancient intellectual traditions preserved mythic frameworks even as scientific understanding improved. Geological surveys of the Ural Mountains, often symbolically associated with the Riphean Range, reveal landscapes rich in mineral deposits and archaeological evidence of metallurgical activity dating back to the Bronze Age. These real geographic features provided a partial foundation for Greek speculation, yet the symbolic content of Hyperborea remained paramount, overshadowing any empirical attempts to locate it within measurable space. A final conceptual reflection brings the chapter to its transition. The northern imagination of the Greeks was shaped not only by environmental and astronomical realities, but also by deeper cultural memories and mythic structures embedded within the Indo-European linguistic and narrative heritage. The chapter concludes in quiet movement toward the next phase, where migrations, cultural memory, and long-distance mythic parallels will inform the reconstruction of Hyperborea's deeper conceptual origins. Conceptual background of Hyperborea acquires greater clarity when examined alongside the deep-time movements of populations across northern Eurasia during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. Although Greek authors of the 7th-3rd centuries BCE had no knowledge of genetic lineages or archaeological chronologies, they inherited fragmented accounts of distant migrations that circulated through steppe intermediaries and ritual narratives embedded within Indo-European traditions. Archaeogenetic studies conducted on human remains associated with the Yamnaya horizon, dated to the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, reveal extensive mobility across the Pontic, Caspian steppe, with groups moving northward into forested regions and westward into Central Europe. These demographic processes reshaped linguistic, cultural, and material landscapes long before Greek ethnographers attempted to interpret the northern world. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence from corded ware settlements in the forest steppe zone demonstrates a synthesis of local forager traditions with incoming pastoralist practices, producing hybrid societies whose ecological adaptations span both steppe and taiga environments. This long-term interaction created a cultural mosaic that Greek writers later encountered through intermediaries, though interpreted within a mythic rather than historical lens. A sensory detail, the soft thud of wooden sled runners on frozen ground, evokes mobility patterns that once defined life across vast northern expanses. The distribution of Indo-European mythological motifs sheds additional light on the structural elements that informed Greek interpretations of Hyperborea. Comparative studies of Vedic, Iranian, Baltic, and Greek textual traditions reveal recurring themes involving northern homelands, sacred mountains, and cyclical offerings to deities linked with solar or cosmic order. While these parallels do not imply a shared historical origin for the Hyperborean motif, they illustrate the persistence of symbolic structures that framed distant landscapes as sources of ritual purity or cosmological significance. Archaeological surveys across the Upper Volga and Kama basins document ritual deposits of animal remains, stone implements, and wooden carvings placed in wetlands or river inlets, suggesting the presence of ceremonial practices that structured interactions with the landscape. Radiocarbon dating confirms that many such practices predate Greek textual references by several millennia, yet the conceptual resonance between ritualized northward orientation and Greek narratives of offerings from Hyperborea suggests that distant themes could have migrated through narrative networks without preserving precise historical content. A conceptual reflection arises. Cultural memory does not transmit events intact, but transforms them into symbols that align with evolving social and intellectual frameworks. Long-distance mobility across Eurasia created opportunities for the diffusion of stories, motifs, and ethnonyms, even when material or linguistic connections remained tenuous. The emergence of the Sema Turbino phenomenon, dated between 2100 and 1900 BCE, demonstrates a rapid spread of metallurgical techniques and weapon types across the taiga zone from the Urals to the Altai. This archaeological horizon, though not directly linked to any Greek tradition, illustrates the capacity of northern societies to maintain expansive contact networks across thousands of kilometers. Metal artifacts associated with this movement, bronze spearheads, socketed axes, and distinctive dagger forms, show technological parallels across distant regions, indicating communication between communities whose cultural practices diverged significantly. Such expansive networks provide a plausible backdrop for the transmission of environmental and cosmographic descriptors that later entered Mediterranean thought. Yet the transformation of these fragments into the image of Hyperborea occurred within Greek literary and philosophical systems rather than through any direct cultural inheritance. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that the Hyperborean motif functions as an interpretive convergence point, where empirical traces of mobility merge with symbolic expectations about the world's northern boundary. By the time Greek authors articulated the Hyperborean theme in its classical form, the deep-time migrations that shaped northern Eurasia were preserved only through compressed cultural memories embedded in mythic structures. Archaeological data from the Fatianovo and Abashevo cultures reveal complex burial practices and material traditions that contributed to broader Indo-European symbolic repertoires. Yet these practices offer no direct continuity with Hyperborea as imagined by the Greeks. Instead, the persistence of directional symbolism, north as a place of ritual origin, remoteness, or cosmic purity, appears to have provided an interpretive scaffold through which Greek thinkers organized disparate fragments of northern information. A conceptual reflection underscores the methodological challenge. Distinguishing between historical memory and structural myth is essential for analyzing how Greek authors produced the Hyperborean motif, not as a recollection of real migrations, but as a cultural construct shaped by inherited narrative forms. As the chapter moves forward, the next step is to investigate how these ancient networks facilitated not only the movement of peoples, but also the circulation of knowledge and symbolic objects. The transmission of northern information into the Mediterranean world, material, ritual, and linguistic, will reveal the mechanisms by which Hyperborea came to occupy its distinctive position in Greek intellectual geography. The circulation of knowledge across northern Eurasia and into the Mediterranean unfolded through a series of interconnected exchange routes long predating the period in which Greek authors began articulating the Hyperborean motif. Archaeological evidence from the forest, steppe, and taiga zones indicates that mobility was a structural feature of societies inhabiting these regions, facilitated by rivers such as the Volga, Kama, and Ob, which served as natural corridors linking disparate ecological zones. Excavations at Bronze Age settlements along these waterways have uncovered metal ornaments, polished stone tools, and carved antler objects that exhibit stylistic connections across vast distances. These findings suggest that technological innovation and symbolic motifs spread through mechanisms of seasonal gathering, ritual exchange, and long-distance travel rather than through centralized political structures. Meanwhile, Mediterranean traders operating along the northern Black Sea coast encountered steppe intermediaries whose wide-ranging mobility brought them into contact with communities far removed from Greek spheres of influence. Through such interactions, fragments of northern environmental knowledge entered Greek thought, though transformed into narrative abstractions consistent with the intellectual frameworks of the archaic and classical periods. A sensory detail, a canoe gliding through a quiet river channel bordered by dense spruce, captures the environmental context from which these early transmissions emerged. The transmission of ritual concepts provides further insight into how Hyperborean imagery took shape within Greek literature. Comparative studies of Indo-European ritual traditions reveal recurring themes involving directional offerings, seasonal transitions, and journeys to remote locations associated with cosmic renewal. Although these motifs cannot be mapped directly onto the Hyperborean tradition, their underlying symbolic structures may have influenced Greek interpretations of distant northern lands. Archaeological evidence from wetland ritual sites in the Volga, Kama region, where objects such as antler carvings, bone figurines, and metal blades were deposited into lakes or marshes, illustrates the presence of ceremonial practices oriented toward the natural landscape. Radiocarbon dating of these deposits places them within a chronological framework extending from the late Neolithic through the early Iron Age, well before Greek ethnographers recorded northern ritual narratives. The persistence of such practices across millennia indicates that northern cultures maintained ritual relationships with their environments that Greek observers could only interpret through the lens of their own religious and philosophical traditions. A conceptual reflection follows. Cultural transmission rarely preserves the meaning of rituals intact. Instead, it fragments and reconfigures them within new narrative systems, producing motifs such as Hyperborean offerings that reflect Greek reinterpretation rather than historical continuity. Material exchange played a central role in shaping Greek perceptions of the northern world, particularly through the movement of amber, a substance prized for its luminosity and exotic origin. Chemical analyses of amber found in Mycenaean Grave and archaic Greek sanctuaries trace its provenance to the southern Baltic coast, demonstrating long-distance trade networks that connected the Mediterranean to regions far beyond its geographic horizon. These networks likely transmitted environmental descriptions alongside material goods, though such descriptions were subject to distortion as they passed through multiple linguistic and cultural intermediaries. Archaeological excavations at Baltic coastal sites associated with the Narva and Combe ceramic cultures reveal extensive production of worked amber, bone tools, and pottery with distinctive textile impressions, underscoring the cultural sophistication of communities inhabiting the region. Yet Greek accounts of the far north framed these areas not as centers of human creativity, but as symbolic landscapes characterized by ritual purity and environmental harmony. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that ancient writers shaped foreign environments according to internal cultural expectations, transforming complex societies into idealized abstractions that aligned with philosophical or moral narratives. Linguistic evidence provides an additional lens through which to understand the incorporation of northern motifs into Greek thought. Ethnonyms appearing in Greek texts, such as Isidones, Arimaspe, and Hyperboreans, exhibit patterns consistent with exonyms transmitted through multiple languages, possibly including Iranian, Uralic, and Turkic intermediaries. Comparative linguistic analyses suggest that some of these names may reflect distorted forms of real population descriptors, though their precise origins remain uncertain. Archaeological evidence from the Minusinsk Basin and forest steppe communities further complicates the linguistic picture, revealing cultural continuities not readily captured through fragmentary textual references. These linguistic complexities reinforce the idea that Hyperborea functioned as a conceptual aggregation point rather than a discrete ethnographic entity, absorbing elements from diverse traditions into a cohesive narrative space. A conceptual reflection underscores the methodological principle that ethnographic names in ancient texts often operate symbolically, representing categories of geographic or cosmological meaning rather than empirically defined populations. The convergence of migration patterns, ritual traditions, material exchange, and linguistic transmission reveals that the Hyperborean motif emerged not from a single historical source, but from the layered interaction of multiple cultural systems. As these systems intersected within Greek intellectual frameworks, they produced a conceptual geography that blended empirical fragments with symbolic meaning. The chapter transitions toward its final section by acknowledging that the next phase of analysis must address how these deep-time influences shaped Greek understanding of northern identity, preparing the ground for a more detailed examination of cultural memory and the interpretive structures that sustain the Hyperborean tradition across centuries. The intersection of long-distance migrations and evolving cultural memory created the conditions under which Greek authors encountered fragments of northern narratives that would later coalesce into the Hyperborean motif. By the time of Herodotus and his contemporaries, the deep-time demographic movements that shaped the Eurasian North had been transformed into residual stories circulating through steppe intermediaries. Archaeological sequences from the Middle Volga, forest steppe zones, and southern Ural regions reveal a patchwork of cultures, Fatianovo, Abashevo, Sintashta, and later Esrubnia, each contributing to the shifting mosaic of population interactions. Excavations at Sintashta fortified settlements show evidence of chariot construction, copper metallurgy, and ritual enclosures aligned with celestial events, indicating a level of social organization that produced durable symbolic repertoires. Radiocarbon analysis dates these sites to the early 2nd millennium BCE, well beyond the temporal horizon accessible to Greek historiography, yet the echoes of such cultures may have persisted through oral traditions transmitted across generations. A sensory detail, the rhythmic clatter of wooden wheels on hardened earth, captures the dynamic mobility that once characterized these societies and may have influenced later imaginings of northern movement and origin. The process by which such distant memories entered Greek thought was neither direct nor continuous. Oral traditions traveling across the steppe could compress centuries of cultural development into simplified motifs, emphasizing direction, remoteness, and ritual centrality rather than historical specificity. Comparative mythology demonstrates that Indo-European traditions frequently associated sacred origins or exceptional purity with northern or eastern directions, framing cosmological order within a schematic spatial structure. Greek authors working within this intellectual environment inherited narrative templates that encouraged the placement of idealized societies at the periphery of the world. Archaeological evidence from the forest tundra zone, including ritual deposits of animal remains, decorated bone objects, and stone settings oriented along cardinal directions, suggests that northern populations engaged in ceremonial practices emphasizing spatial symbolism. Although these practices cannot be linked directly to Greek conceptions of Hyperborea, they illustrate the types of environmental and ritual experiences that might have been refracted into Mediterranean thought. A conceptual reflection emerges. Myths do not preserve historical events themselves, but reflect the structural logic through which societies interpret the past. Linguistic and cultural discontinuities across Eurasia further shaped the transmission of northern narratives into Greek ethnography. The Iranian-speaking Scythians, whose territories extended from the lower Danube to the Altai, played a crucial intermediary role in conveying information from forest and tundra populations to the Mediterranean. Scythian mobility and diplomatic engagement with Greek colonies provided channels through which stories of distant lands were communicated, often reframed to suit Scythian cultural norms. Archaeological finds from Scythian royal kurgans, including ornate gold ornaments, weaponry, and horse harness fittings, demonstrate the sophistication of these communities and their ability to incorporate distant influences into local expressive traditions. While such material culture does not confirm any direct connection to Hyperborea, it supports the idea that wide-ranging exchange networks facilitated the circulation of cultural motifs across regions. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that ancient ethnographic categories often mask the heterogeneity of populations that contributed to the narratives transmitted to Greek audiences. As these fragments accumulated within Greek intellectual systems, they became reorganized according to the philosophical, poetic, and ethnographic priorities of the archaic and classical periods. Hyperborea emerged as a conceptual synthesis rather than a recollection of any single culture or migration. It combined environmental features drawn from high-latitude regions, ritual themes resonant with Indo-European symbolic structures, and geographical abstractions shaped by Greek cosmology. This synthesis proved enduring because it aligned with Greek concerns about spatial order, moral balance, and the limits of human habitation. Archaeological evidence from northern Eurasia, including settlement sequences, mortuary patterns, and environmental reconstructions, reveals dynamic societies adapting to shifting climates and diverse ecological niches, a reality far removed from the static harmony attributed to Hyperborea. Yet these empirical findings underscore the methodological value of examining Hyperborea through the lens of cultural memory. The motif represents not a historical civilization, but an interpretive construction built from layered perceptions of the North. The chapter concludes by acknowledging that understanding Hyperborea requires attention not only to migrations and cultural memory, but also to the mechanisms through which information traveled across vast distances into the Mediterranean world. The next chapter will examine these transmission networks, economic, ritual, and informational, that shaped Greek perceptions of the northern frontier and allowed Hyperborea to occupy a distinct place in the intellectual geography of antiquity. By the time Greek authors first articulated the idea of Hyperborea between the 7th and 5th centuries BCE, the Eurasian steppe had already functioned for millennia as one of the most dynamic transmission corridors in the ancient world. Human mobility across this vast ecological belt linked the northern forests, southern plains, and distant mountain zones through patterns of migration, pastoral movement, and exchange that left enduring archaeological signatures. Excavations along the Middle Volga and Lower Don reveal settlements, burial complexes, and seasonal encampments associated with diverse populations, including early Iranian-speaking groups, forest steppe communities, and mobile pastoralists, whose interaction created channels for the movement of goods and stories. Radiocarbon sequences from these sites show overlapping occupational phases from the Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, demonstrating the long-term continuity of these networks. Meanwhile, Greek colonies along the Black Sea littoral, such as Olbia and Chersonesus, occupied strategic positions where information carried by traders, mercenaries, and emissaries from the steppe converged. A sensory detail, the dull clang of metal traded from distant northern workshops, suggests how material goods and narrative fragments traveled together across the steppe. The archaeological distribution of metal artifacts provides further insight into how northern technological traditions reached Greek awareness. The Sema Turbino phenomenon, which spread distinctive bronze weapon forms and metallurgical techniques across the taiga and forest steppe between 2100 and 1900 BCE, illustrates the capacity of northern societies to maintain long-distance connections. Although these developments predate Greek ethnography by more than a millennium, they demonstrate deep historical precedents for the transfer of ideas and objects across Eurasia. Bronze spearheads, socketed daggers, and ornaments associated with this horizon have been found across areas spanning from western Siberia to northern Mongolia, indicating rapid diffusion facilitated by mobile specialists and seasonal aggregation sites. Later metallurgical traditions in the forest steppe continued this pattern, supplying metal goods that eventually reached Scythian populations and entered the exchange networks linked to Greek colonies. While Hyperborea, as described by Greek authors, does not correspond to any archaeological culture, the structural pathways through which Greek thinkers encountered northern motifs reflect the long-term circulation of material and symbolic forms across the steppe. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that transmission networks shape not only the movement of objects, but also the conceptual frameworks through which distant landscapes are imagined. Trade in prestige goods intensified these north-south connections. Amber, furs, carved bone objects, and metalwork from northern and northeastern Eurasia appear in archaeological contexts across the Pontic region, illustrating the integration of Greek settlements into broader economic circuits. Chemical analyses of amber beads found at sanctuaries in the Aegean trace their origins to the Baltic coast, demonstrating that goods from the far north reached Greek religious centers where they acquired new symbolic meanings. Excavations at Baltic coastal sites reveal production debris associated with amber working, drilled fragments, unfinished beads, and polishing stones, situating these objects within long-distance exchange systems that transmitted not only materials, but also information about northern environments. Palynological data from the same regions show forest compositions shaped by Holocene climatic fluctuations, reinforcing the ecological backdrop against which northern societies operated. Greek awareness of these areas, though indirect, was informed by accounts of distinctive light cycles, expansive river systems, and climatic extremes conveyed by intermediaries. A conceptual reflection follows. Material trade allowed distant ecological realities to enter Greek consciousness, though filtered through interpretive frameworks that emphasized symbolic coherence over empirical precision. Mobility across the Eurasian steppe also facilitated the movement of ritual narratives that shaped Greek depictions of Hyperborea. Scythian religious practices, documented archaeologically through hearth altars, ritual deposits, and decorated drinking vessels, incorporated elements drawn from both steppe and forest cultural traditions. These practices may have preserved motifs originating in northern Eurasia, though altered through Scythian social and political structures before reaching Greek observers. Herodotus' descriptions of Scythian rituals, while stylized, reflect real ceremonial behaviors evidenced by excavations at kurgans containing offerings of animal bone, carved wood, and metal artifacts. Stable isotope analysis of these remains indicates seasonal movement associated with pastoral lifeways, reinforcing the idea that Scythian identity was shaped by environmental rhythms extending far beyond the Greek cultural horizon. The transmission of ritual narratives across such networks provided Greek authors with models for imagining distant societies, though refracted through Mediterranean concepts of religious order and cosmic balance. A conceptual reflection highlights how ritual practices become abstracted when transmitted across cultural boundaries, producing motifs such as Hyperborean offerings that reveal more about Greek interpretive strategies than about northern ceremonial life. The section moves toward its transition by acknowledging that the mechanisms of knowledge transmission, economic, ritual, and linguistic, did not produce stable or coherent ethnographic information. Instead, these networks fragmented, condensed, and recontextualized northern realities into forms compatible with Greek intellectual traditions. The next section will examine the interpretive processes through which Greek authors transformed these fragments into the structured motif of Hyperborea. The interpretive transformation of northern information within Greek thought depended not only on the material pathways of exchange, but also on the semiotic conditions under which knowledge circulated. Greek authors of the archaic and classical periods approached foreign reports through an intellectual framework that prioritized coherence, moral resonance, and cosmological order. As a result, descriptions of northern peoples, transmitted through Scythian intermediaries or derived from fragmented travel accounts, were reshaped according to narrative patterns already embedded within Greek literature. Archaeological evidence from steppe settlements, including habitation layers at the lower Dnieper and Don, reveals social structures characterized by mobility, flexible kinship organization, and seasonal congregation at ritual or trading sites. Radiocarbon dating across these layers demonstrates periods of stability interspersed with episodes of relocation driven by climatic and economic pressures. Meanwhile, Greek textual traditions tended to filter such variability into simplified structures, presenting distant societies as static archetypes rather than dynamic communities. A sensory detail, the soft clatter of hooves on frozen ground during winter migrations, remains part of the environmental context that informed these transmissions but rarely survived in Greek representation. The role of linguistic mediation further shaped Greek perceptions of the far north. Ethnonyms such as Aramaspi, Isidones, and other northern groups appear in Greek texts in forms suggesting multiple layers of translation through Iranian and Uralic languages before entering Hellenic discourse. Comparative linguistic studies show that phonetic distortions occur consistently when exonyms move across cultural boundaries, especially in oral transmission contexts. Such distortions introduced ambiguity into the identity of northern peoples, enabling Greek authors to assign symbolic functions to them rather than treating them as empirically defined populations. Archaeological work in the Minusinsk Basin and forest steppe regions reveals cultural continuities that contradict the homogenized depictions of northern groups in Greek ethnography. These findings demonstrate complex social organization and technological adaptation, including metallurgy, textile production, and ritual activities. Yet the Greek framework favored moral archetypes over ethnographic detail, interpreting unfamiliar societies as idealized counterparts or antithetical contrasts to Hellenic norms. A conceptual reflection emerges. Ethnographic categories in antiquity often reveal the interpretive needs of the documenting culture rather than the lived realities of the communities described. Economic exchanges across the steppe further influenced the conceptualization of Hyperborea. Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast served as hubs where northern materials, amber, furs, metal ornaments, and carved bone objects entered Mediterranean markets. Excavations at Olbia and Panticapaeum have uncovered imported goods alongside inscriptions and graffiti indicating multilingual interactions. These archaeological contexts suggest that Greek inhabitants frequently engaged with traders whose cultural backgrounds extended beyond the Scythian world. Palynological studies from the Baltic and Volga regions indicate environmental conditions that shaped the production of materials exchanged with Greek communities, including dense boreal forests and extensive river systems. Yet Greek interpretations of these goods emphasize their exotic qualities rather than their ecological origins. The luminous appearance of Baltic amber, for instance, contributed to its association with solar deities and its later integration into Hyperborean narratives centered on Apollo. A conceptual reflection follows. Material objects acquire symbolic force when their origins lie beyond familiar landscapes, enabling them to serve as anchors for imagined geographies. The ritual dimension of transmission played a parallel role in the development of Hyperborean imagery. Herodotus' accounts of Scythian funerary practices, though stylized, correspond with archaeological evidence of mortuary rituals involving animal sacrifices, inverted vessels, carved wood, and elaborate textile wrappings. Stable isotope analysis of human remains from these burial contexts indicates mobility patterns linked to pastoral economies, supporting the environmental rhythms that shaped Scythian identity. Through such intermediaries, fragments of ritual behavior associated with northern populations may have entered Greek thought, though refracted through cultural expectations that emphasized order, purity, and idealized isolation. Greek authors interpreted ritual narratives through the conceptual lens of cosmological alignment, attributing to the Hyperboreans a role within a sacred geography extending from the distant north to sanctuaries such as Delos. A conceptual reflection highlights that when rituals cross cultural boundaries, their meaning shifts toward interpretive abstraction, revealing the intellectual frameworks of the receiving society. These multi-layered transmissions, material, linguistic, ritual, and economic, produced an informational environment in which Hyperborea could emerge as a stable narrative motif despite the instability of its underlying data. The networks that linked the Eurasian north to the Mediterranean world did not provide Greek authors with coherent ethnographic detail. Instead, they offered fragments susceptible to reorganization within symbolic and cosmological structures. As the chapter moves toward its final section, the analysis will focus on how Greek authors codified these fragments into a consistent motif, transforming Hyperborea into an intellectual landmark situated at the intersection of geography, myth, and cultural memory. The codification of Hyperborea within Greek intellectual tradition reflects a selective synthesis of transmitted northern material reshaped into a coherent symbolic geography. By the classical period, Greek authors had begun integrating scattered references to distant lands into broader ethnographic and cosmological frameworks, assigning Hyperborea a position beyond the reach of conventional habitation while simultaneously connecting it to ritual centers such as Delos. Archaeological evidence from the Pontic steppe demonstrates that Greek colonies functioned as linguistic and cultural filters through which northern information was refracted. Finds at Olbia, including inscribed pottery fragments, imported metalwork, and locally produced votive figurines, indicate extensive interaction with Scythian intermediaries, who themselves maintained contact networks reaching deeper into the forest steppe and taiga regions. Radiocarbon sequences from these intermediary zones show periods of settlement continuity interspersed with episodes of mobility driven by climatic variability, underscoring the dynamic nature of the societies whose practices and narratives ultimately filtered into Greek thought. A sensory detail, the faint creak of leather harnesses during long-distance travel, evokes the experiential texture underlying the transmission of such distant accounts. The formation of Hyperborea as an idealized society emerged from the interpretive tendencies of Greek ethnography, which frequently organized foreign peoples along axes of moral, climatic, and cosmological significance. Poetic traditions cast Hyperborea as a realm of ritual order and longevity, insulated from the corrupting influences attributed to more familiar regions. Yet archaeological evidence from northern Eurasia paints a picture of communities responding to shifting environmental conditions through flexible subsistence strategies, mobility, and periodic aggregation. Excavations at forest tundra sites in the Ural foothills reveal pit houses, hearths, and tool assemblages designed for seasonal adaptation rather than permanent settlement. Stable isotope analyses of faunal remains indicate reliance on migratory species, highlighting the ecological rhythms that defined northern lifeways. The contrast between empirical findings and Greek depictions underscores the interpretive distance between lived reality and literary representation. A conceptual reflection acknowledges that ancient ethnography often recast ecological adaptation as moral or cosmological alignment, transforming practical strategies into symbolic attributes. The association of Hyperborea with Apollonian ritual further illustrates the interpretive layering that shaped its conceptualization. Greek narratives describing offerings sent from Hyperborea to Delos reflect an attempt to integrate distant lands into a sacred geography structured around directional movement and cosmic order. Archaeological investigations at Delos demonstrate significant ritual activity during the Archaic and Classical periods, including the deposition of imported ceramics, metal offerings, and terracotta figurines within temple precincts. Stratigraphic analysis of these deposits reveals phases of intensified ritual participation corresponding with Pan-Hellenic festivals. Although none of the offerings can be directly linked to northern Eurasia, their presence in a sanctuary associated with solar symbolism helped legitimize the integration of Hyperborea into Greek religious cosmology. A conceptual reflection follows. Religious landscapes often incorporate distant, even imagined regions to express the universality of ritual structures, allowing conceptual geographies like Hyperborea to acquire stability despite the absence of empirical grounding. The Hellenistic period introduced new attempts to reconcile empirical geography with inherited mythic traditions. Scholars such as Diodorus Siculus synthesized earlier narratives, merging poetic imagery with cartographic speculation. Geological surveys of the Ural Mountains, often associated in ancient thought with the boundary of the known world, reveal extensive mineral resources and archaeological evidence for metallurgical activity dating back to the Bronze Age. Although Greek authors lacked detailed knowledge of these regions, their awareness of distant mountain ranges provided a partial framework for situating Hyperborea within a speculative topography. Meanwhile, astronomical theories developed during this period further enhanced the symbolic value of extreme northern latitudes, which were viewed as sites where cosmic order manifested in exaggerated form through prolonged daylight cycles and angular solar motion. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that Hyperborea persisted because it occupied an interpretive position at the convergence of geography, cosmology, and cultural memory, serving as a boundary image that articulated the limits of human knowledge. The chapter concludes by synthesizing the structural conditions that allowed Hyperborea to take shape within Greek thought. Steppe networks transmitted fragmented accounts of environmental and cultural features. Greek interpretive frameworks reorganized these fragments into an idealized northern realm, and evolving scientific and philosophical systems reinforced the motif's persistence. As the documentary turns to the next chapter, attention will shift from the transmission pathways themselves to the ritual and symbolic associations that granted Hyperborea its enduring cultural significance within the Greek world. The ritual dimension of Hyperborea represents one of the most distinctive aspects of its development within Greek intellectual tradition, emerging from a fusion of poetic allusion, ethnographic speculation, and the symbolic logic of sacred geography. Greek narratives describe offerings traveling from Hyperborea to the sanctuary of Apollo at Delos, outlining a ritual pathway that connected the distant north with a central locus of Mediterranean religious identity. Although the historical basis of this tradition remains elusive, archaeological evidence from Delos provides a contextual framework for understanding the cultural processes that may have inspired such accounts. Excavations at the Artemision and adjacent cultic precincts reveal stratified layers of votive deposits, imported ceramics, and inscribed dedications dating from the 8th to the 4th centuries BCE. Radiocarbon analysis of organic residues on ceremonial vessels indicates repeated episodes of large-scale ritual activity, reflecting Delos's central role in Panhellenic worship. A sensory detail, the muted clatter of terracotta figurines placed carefully within stone-lined pits, evokes the atmosphere of accumulated devotion that surrounded the sanctuary and shaped later interpretations of distant ritual contributors. The concept of north-to-south offerings aligns with broader patterns of directional symbolism within Indo-European traditions, where the movement of sacred objects often reflects cosmological orientation rather than empirical geography. Comparative studies of Vedic, Iranian, and Baltic ritual structures reveal thematic parallels involving journeys to remote locations, seasonal transitions, and the restoration of cosmic order through offerings. While these similarities do not establish a direct link to Greek narratives of Hyperborea, they highlight the broader field of symbolic logic within which these traditions operated. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites across the forest steppe and taiga zones, including wetland deposits of carved bone objects, stone tools, and metal blades, suggests that northern societies maintained ceremonial relationships with their environments rooted in spatial and temporal patterns. Radiocarbon dating places many of these deposits within the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, well before the formation of Greek Hyperborean narratives. A conceptual reflection arises. The ritual orientation of ancient societies often becomes distorted or reinterpreted when encountered through distant transmission networks, leading Greek authors to integrate northern symbolic fragments into their own sacred geographies. Within Greek thought, the association between Hyperborea and Apollo reflects an intricate interplay between ritual significance and cosmological speculation. Apollo's identity as a god of order, harmony, and solar alignment made him a suitable recipient of offerings believed to originate from regions where environmental rhythms diverged from Mediterranean norms. The Hyperborean legend situates Apollo's periodic sojourns in the far north, emphasizing his connection to cyclical renewal and the restoration of ritual balance. Although these themes belong to poetic tradition rather than historical record, their persistence suggests a cultural effort to incorporate distant landscapes into a coherent cosmological system. Archaeological investigations at Delos reveal the presence of foreign goods, including amber beads, metal ornaments, and imported pottery, which may have been interpreted by Greek worshippers as evidence of ritual participation from distant lands. Chemical analyses of amber artifacts trace their origins to the Baltic region, indicating long-distance exchange networks that brought northern materials into Mediterranean sanctuaries. While these objects do not confirm Hyperborean offerings, they demonstrate how exotic materials gained sacred resonance within ritual contexts. A conceptual reflection follows. Objects traveling across vast distances acquire symbolic weight not only through their rarity, but through the interpretive frameworks that situate them within sacred narratives. The ritual significance attributed to Hyperborea also reflects Greek perceptions of purity and uncorrupted tradition. In literary sources, Hyperboreans are depicted as adherents of ancient rites preserved in isolation from the turbulence of historical change. This idealized portrayal contrasts with archaeological evidence from northern Eurasia, where ritual practices evolved in response to environmental pressures and shifting social structures. Excavations at ceremonial sites in the northern Ural foothills reveal complex arrangements of stones, animal bones, and wooden markers indicating ritual cycles tied to subsistence rhythms rather than cosmological abstraction. Stable isotope analysis of faunal remains from these contexts suggests seasonal feasting and offerings associated with migration patterns, highlighting the pragmatic dimensions of northern ritual life. Yet Greek authors transformed such ecological embeddedness into signs of spiritual constancy, interpreting northern rituals as evidence of a world untouched by decadence or disorder. A conceptual reflection underscores the interpretive mechanisms by which ancient societies externalized ideals onto distant geographies, transforming empirical diversity into symbolic exemplarity. As this section moves toward transition, it becomes clear that the ritual associations of Hyperborea emerged not from direct cultural exchange, but from the convergence of imported materials, cosmological symbolism, and Greek religious interpretation. The next section will examine in greater depth how these ritual narratives developed across literary traditions, and how the imagined pathways connecting Hyperborea to Delos became integrated into the broader map of Greek sacred geography. The literary development of Hyperborean ritual narratives relied on the interpretive flexibility inherent in Greek mythopoetic tradition, where distant regions often functioned as stages upon which cosmological and ethical ideals could be projected. Pindar's references to Hyperborean offerings, embedded within his broader poetic program of celebrating virtue and divine favor, illustrate how the motif entered the symbolic repertoire of elite Greek culture. Although Pindar's account provides no geographical specificity, it emphasizes the continuity of ritual practice across vast distances, implying a cosmological unity under Apollo's patronage. Archaeological evidence from Delos supports the notion that the sanctuary operated as a node within a far-reaching ritual network. Excavations have revealed imported votive ceramics, bronze tripods, and terracotta figurines from various regions of the Mediterranean, demonstrating the island's role as a focal point for Panhellenic devotion. Stratigraphic analysis of these deposits indicates periods of intense ceremonial activity during festivals associated with Apollo, suggesting that narratives linking the god to distant lands were readily integrated into local ritual discourse. A sensory detail, the soft resonance of lyre strings during festival processions, captures the ceremonial atmosphere in which Hyperborean stories gained interpretive legitimacy. Herodotus' treatment of Hyperborean offerings introduces a more ethnographic framing, situating the tradition within a discourse aimed at reconciling inherited narratives with empirical inquiry. He reports that offerings were passed from one northern population to another before reaching Delos, though he acknowledges the implausibility of tracing their entire path. Linguistic and archaeological evidence from regions associated with these intermediary groups, particularly Scythians, Thracians, and other communities along the Danube and Dnieper, provides a partial context for assessing the transmission mechanisms he describes. Excavations of hilltop settlements and riverine trading posts reveal material assemblages characterized by mixed cultural influences, including Greek pottery, Scythian metalwork, and locally produced artifacts. Radiocarbon sequences from these contexts demonstrate sustained contact between Mediterranean and non-Mediterranean populations, though they do not confirm the ritual pathways described by Herodotus. A conceptual reflection highlights the methodological challenge inherent in distinguishing historical tradition from interpretive narrative. Ancient authors often embedded empirical observations within symbolic frameworks, producing accounts that reveal more about Greek intellectual priorities than about actual movement across Eurasia. Hyperborean offerings also appear in later Hellenistic literature, where they serve to reinforce philosophical arguments concerning cosmic harmony and divine order. Diodorus Siculus, synthesizing earlier accounts, situates Hyperborea within a speculative northern geography that aligns ritual activity with celestial cycles. Paleoclimatic reconstructions from the Arctic fringe demonstrate seasonal variability in sunlight, which may have influenced distant stories transmitted southward and later interpreted as signs of ritual purity or cosmic significance. Archaeological findings from northern Eurasia, including alignments of stone circles and ceremonial structures oriented toward solstitial horizons, provide evidence that local populations engaged in practices reflecting awareness of celestial rhythms. While these structures belong to distinct cultural traditions and predate Greek accounts, their existence underscores the broader human tendency to integrate ritual activity with environmental cycles. A conceptual reflection arises when cosmological and ecological patterns converge. Distant societies may be interpreted through universalizing frameworks that impose coherence upon fragmented information. The symbolic function of Hyperborean offerings within Greek religion extended beyond the material or historical plausibility of such practices. By situating ritual contributions at the edge of the known world, Greek authors emphasized the universality of divine order and the integrative capacity of sanctuaries like Delos. Archaeological surveys of pathways leading to the Delian sanctuary reveal architectural features, stone-paved processional routes, boundary markers, and altars that structured the movement of ritual participants. These features framed local ceremonial activity within a larger conceptual geography, allowing offerings from imagined or distant lands to occupy a place within ritual narratives. Palynological studies from Delos and nearby islands document environmental changes associated with increased human activity during the classical and Hellenistic periods, including shifts in vegetation patterns caused by grazing and agricultural expansion. These changes reflect the sanctuary's enduring importance as a site of pilgrimage and ritual coordination. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that sacred geographies often incorporate imagined landscapes to articulate the expansiveness of divine influence, allowing Hyperborea to serve as both a symbolic origin point and a marker of the limits of the inhabited world. The accumulation of Hyperborean ritual associations across Greek literature demonstrates the capacity of mythic geography to integrate diverse sources of information, environmental, material, linguistic, and symbolic, into a coherent narrative framework. As this section transitions to the next, attention will turn toward the comparative analysis of northern ritual practices and their possible reflections in the symbolic structures underlying Greek representations of Hyperborea. This approach will clarify how real practices in distant environments may have informed, however indirectly, the ritual imagery embedded within Greek sacred narrative. The comparative study of ritual practices across northern Eurasia and the Mediterranean provides a methodological vantage point from which the symbolic architecture of Hyperborean narratives can be more precisely interpreted. Archaeological evidence from wetland ritual sites in the Volga, Kama region, including deposits of antler carvings, wooden idols, and intentionally fractured stone tools, demonstrates that northern societies embedded ceremonial activity within environmental cycles governed by the movement of water, light, and migratory species. Radiocarbon dating places many of these deposits within the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, indicating a deep history of ritual behavior oriented toward the landscape rather than toward fixed architectural centers. Meanwhile, Greek ritual traditions, though structurally different, also emphasized spatial alignment and cyclical renewal, particularly in contexts associated with Apollo. The convergence of these thematic elements across disparate cultural regions offers insight into how Greek authors may have interpreted northern ritual fragments transmitted through trade or oral tradition. A sensory detail, the softened echo of footsteps on marshland during seasonal ceremonies, evokes the atmospheric qualities that shaped northern ritual experience and may have contributed to its later Mediterranean reinterpretation. The symbolic movement of offerings from the north to Delos reflects Greek attempts to integrate distant regions into a unified sacred geography characterized by directional order and cosmic equilibrium. Archaeological excavations at Delian sanctuaries reveal formalized pathways guiding ritual participants toward altars and temple precincts, indicating an emphasis on regulated spatial progression. Stratigraphic analysis of these sites shows multiple phases of expansion and refurbishment, corresponding with increased religious activity from the Archaic through the Hellenistic periods. Imported votives, including amber beads, metal ornaments, and painted pottery, appear consistently in these layers, demonstrating that foreign objects played a role in articulating Delos's cosmological significance. While the presence of Baltic amber cannot substantiate the Hyperborean tradition, it illustrates the material conditions under which Greek worshippers could envision distant lands participating in their ritual world. A conceptual reflection follows. Sacred geographies often rely on the imaginative incorporation of distant sources to express the universality of divine systems, creating conceptual bridges between real and imagined landscapes. Northern ritual practices associated with celestial observation provide another dimension for understanding how Hyperborea entered Greek cosmology. Stone alignments in the Scandinavian and North Russian regions, many oriented toward solstitial sunrise or sunset, indicate long-standing cultural engagements with astronomical cycles. Archaeological surveys of these sites reveal configurations of stones arranged in circular, triangular, or linear patterns, suggesting ceremonial functions connected to seasonal transitions. Stable isotope analysis of human and animal remains found near some of these structures implies periodic gatherings for feasting or communal rites. Although these traditions predate and remain culturally distinct from Greek religious practice, they demonstrate the prevalence of solar-oriented ritual behavior across Eurasia. When fragments of such practices reached Greek intellectual circles, perhaps through steppe intermediaries, they were readily interpreted within Apollonian frameworks, emphasizing solar harmony and cosmological balance. A conceptual reflection highlights that ancient cultures often universalized astronomical motifs, enabling distant rituals to be absorbed into existing religious systems irrespective of their original significance. The idealization of hyperboreal ritual purity also reflects Greek cultural concerns regarding continuity and ancestral tradition. Literary depictions present Hyperboreans as preservers of ancient rites, untouched by the political and social transformations that characterized Greek history. This portrayal finds no direct parallel in the archaeological record of northern Eurasia, where ritual behavior evolved in response to shifting ecological and social conditions. Excavations at Uralic ceremonial sites reveal changes in material offerings, architectural arrangements, and deposition patterns across centuries, indicating cultural dynamism rather than static preservation. Yet Greek authors recast this variability into an image of unbroken ritual lineage, projecting their desire for stability onto distant populations. A conceptual reflection underscores that imagined societies often function as repositories for ideals perceived as vulnerable within the author's own cultural contexts. The integration of Hyperborea into Greek sacred geography exemplifies how ritual narratives serve as mechanisms for organizing cultural memory across vast spatial distances. By embedding Hyperborean offerings within the ceremonial cycles of Delos, Greek authors constructed a symbolic geography capable of expressing the continuity of divine influence from the edges of the known world to its central religious institutions. The archaeological, linguistic, and environmental evidence examined across this chapter demonstrates that Hyperborea functioned as a conceptual intersection rather than as a historical polity, synthesizing diverse fragments of northern knowledge into an interpretive framework governed by Greek ritual logic. The chapter transitions softly toward the next inquiry, the examination of northern material culture itself, which will reveal how the artistic and technological traditions of real Arctic and subarctic communities shaped, indirectly and conceptually, the imagined aesthetic of the Hyperborean realm. The study of northern Eurasian material culture provides a crucial empirical counterpoint to Greek literary constructions of Hyperborea, revealing the aesthetic, technological, and symbolic practices of communities inhabiting regions that lay beyond the Mediterranean geographic horizon. Archaeological surveys across Karelia, the Kola Peninsula, and the northern coastlines of Norway and Russia document artistic traditions dating from the Mesolithic through the early Iron Age, characterized by carved bone objects, incised stone tools, and extensive petroglyph assemblages. Excavations at sites such as Zalavruga and Canazero have uncovered rock carvings depicting hunting scenes, boat processions, and animal figures rendered with precision and rhythmic composition, demonstrating the cultural centrality of mobility and ecological engagement. Radiocarbon sequences place these petroglyphs from approximately the 6th to the 3rd millennium BCE, illustrating a long continuity of artistic expression rooted in environmental observation rather than mythological abstraction as understood by Greek authors. A sensory detail, the tactile grain of stone beneath the hands of ancient carvers, evokes the intimate relationship between northern artists and their landscape. The artistic traditions of the far north reveal aesthetic values grounded in subsistence practices, seasonal movement, and the symbolic ordering of the natural world. Bone and antler carvings recovered from habitation layers at sites in Finland and northwest Russia illustrate a sophisticated understanding of form and material properties. These objects often depict reindeer, waterfowl, and marine mammals, reflecting the ecological importance of these species within northern economies. Stable isotope analysis of faunal remains from these contexts indicates diets heavily reliant on migratory animals, demonstrating the environmental rhythms that guided artistic representation. Meanwhile, Greek descriptions of Hyperborea emphasize ritual purity, serenity, and idealized environmental conditions, projecting symbolic narratives onto regions whose real cultural outputs reveal dynamism and ecological adaptation. A conceptual reflection emerges. Artistic traditions encode environmental knowledge and cultural memory, yet their interpretation across great distances is shaped by the frameworks of the receiving culture, leading Greek authors to read symbolic order where northern artists expressed ecological intimacy. Metalworking traditions in northern Eurasia also illustrate cultural complexity that contrasts with the simplified images embedded in Greek ethnography. Excavations across the forest steppe and taiga zones have uncovered bronze knives, spearheads, and ornaments associated with the Sama, Turbino, and related metallurgical horizons. These objects exhibit distinctive technological features, including socketed construction and intricate casting techniques, indicating both innovation and long-distance transmission of metallurgical knowledge. Radiocarbon data associated with these assemblages place them between 2100 and 1500 BCE, revealing a technological landscape deeply interconnected across vast distances. While Greek authors lacked direct awareness of such traditions, the presence of northern metal goods in Scythian contexts and their occasional appearance in Greek colonies suggests that metalwork contributed to the perception of northern regions as zones of unusual skill and resource abundance. A conceptual reflection notes that objects traveling without their cultural context often become reinterpreted as symbols of exceptionalism, enabling Greek narratives to associate Hyperborea with a form of idealized craftsmanship or innate harmony. Portable art, including engraved slate pendants, small figurines, and decorated tools, further demonstrates the symbolic repertoires that circulated across northern Eurasia. These artifacts reveal themes of transformation, mobility, and environmental orientation, reflecting both practical and ceremonial dimensions of material culture. Archaeological excavation at the Olny Ostrov Cemetery provides a striking example. The burial assemblages include elaborately carved antler artifacts and ornaments that indicate both ritual significance and social differentiation. Analysis of human remains from this site, dated to the 6th millennium BCE, reveals dietary diversity and long-term habitation, countering Greek assumptions that northern populations lived in static or marginal conditions. Yet when faint echoes of such material traditions reached Mediterranean audiences, likely through Scythian intermediaries, they were reframed within Greek symbolic structures that emphasized harmony, longevity, and purity rather than ecological resilience. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that material culture, when removed from its archaeological context, often becomes a vessel for interpretive projection, facilitating the development of conceptual geographies such as Hyperborea. The section begins to turn toward its thematic transition by acknowledging that northern art and material culture offer tangible evidence for the diversity and sophistication of societies whose existence Greek authors only partially perceived. As the chapter moves forward, the next section will examine how the stylistic and technological qualities of these artifacts shaped, however indirectly, the aesthetic dimensions of the Hyperborean idea, revealing how empirical material traditions intersected with literary and philosophical constructions of the northern world. The stylistic qualities of northern Eurasian art reveal an aesthetic lexicon grounded in ecological attentiveness and rhythmic engagement with the natural world, a lexicon that contrasts with yet indirectly influenced Greek conceptions of Hyperborea. Petroglyph traditions from Karelia and the White Sea region exhibit compositional patterns emphasizing movement, arched bodies of elk in mid-stride, elongated boats filled with rowers, and sequences of human figures arranged in procession-like order. Archaeological analysis of tool marks on these carvings demonstrates that artists used stone chisels with varying degrees of pressure and angle, producing textures that respond to the rock's natural contours. Radiocarbon dates associated with nearby habitation layers place these traditions across several millennia, indicating the endurance of visual motifs tied to hunting, navigation, and community organization. While Greek authors had no direct access to such artworks, intermediary descriptions of northern landscapes may have conveyed impressions of coordinated movement and environmental harmony, elements later reinterpreted as symbolic attributes of Hyperborean life. A sensory detail, the faint echo of waves along a rock face bearing ancient carvings, anchors the experiential dimension of this artistic engagement. The material culture of northern Eurasia also illustrates a refined understanding of portable symbolism, with carved pendants, bone figurines, and decorated tools functioning as markers of identity, ritual allegiance, or ecological orientation. Excavations at sites in Finland and the Baltic region have uncovered pendants shaped like waterfowl, elk, and fish, animals central to subsistence cycles and seasonal migrations. Stable isotope analysis of faunal remains from these areas indicates reliance on varied ecological zones, lakes, rivers, coastal waters, suggesting that symbolic representations of animals served as reminders of the interconnected rhythms that sustained daily life. Meanwhile, Greek narratives of Hyperborea emphasize spiritual constancy and the absence of conflict, projecting an idealized stability onto populations whose archaeological record shows adaptive flexibility and cultural dynamism. A conceptual reflection emerges. Symbolic objects acquire new layers of meaning when transmitted across cultural boundaries, allowing distant traditions to be reimagined within conceptual frameworks that prioritize harmony over ecological detail. Metalworking traditions offer additional insight into the technological sophistication of northern communities and their possible influence on Greek perceptions of the far north. Artifacts associated with the Sama, Turbino horizon, and related metallurgical traditions exhibit intricate casting techniques and standardized forms, suggesting specialized knowledge shared across dispersed regions. Radiocarbon sequences from sites in the western Siberian forest steppe confirm the rapid spread of these objects across thousands of kilometers during the early 2nd millennium BCE. Although the cultural mechanisms behind this diffusion remain debated, the presence of northern metal goods in Scythian contexts, and occasionally in Greek colonial assemblages, indicates that such objects entered long-distance exchange networks. Greek authors, encountering these materials without their cultural context, may have interpreted them as signs of northern ingenuity or natural abundance, contributing to the conceptual elevation of Hyperborea as a land of exceptional purity or cosmic alignment. A conceptual reflection follows. Technological artifacts, when detached from their origins, become abstract symbols that absorb narrative significance within receiving cultures. Textile traditions in northern Eurasia further demonstrate the complexity of material expression in Arctic and subarctic societies. While organic materials rarely survive in the archaeological record, impressions on pottery and the occasional preservation of woven fragments indicate the use of intricate patterns and durable fibers suited to harsh climates. These textiles reflect both aesthetic sensibilities and functional adaptation, revealing technological choices grounded in environmental demands. Greek authors, lacking direct knowledge of such traditions, nonetheless integrated northern textiles into imagined descriptions of Hyperborean simplicity, presenting the far north as a realm where material culture was aligned with natural order rather than shaped by necessity. This interpretive shift illustrates how environmental adaptation becomes moralized when viewed through distant cosmological frameworks. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that material culture provides evidence not only of technological capability, but also of the interpretive transformations that occur when artifacts, and the societies producing them, are conceptualized through external narratives. The integration of northern artifacts into Greek intellectual history occurred primarily through indirect channels: trade, diplomacy, travel law. Yet the cumulative effect of these encounters shaped the aesthetic dimensions of Hyperborean representation. Greek authors did not describe specific northern objects, nor did they attempt to reconstruct northern artistic traditions. Instead, they absorbed the symbolic implications of distant craftsmanship into broader narratives about cosmic order, ritual purity, and environmental harmony. As the chapter approaches its next transition, the analysis will turn toward examining how Greek geographical and navigational limitations further influenced the imaginative construction of Hyperborea, reinforcing the conceptual divide between observed reality and the idealized northern realm. The interpretive distance between northern Eurasian material culture and Greek representations of Hyperborea becomes especially evident when considering the role that abstraction played in the transformation of empirical artifacts into conceptual motifs. Greek authors did not encounter northern artistic traditions directly, nor did they possess an archaeological sensibility capable of evaluating the age, distribution, or context of northern material culture. Instead, they relied on secondary descriptions that conveyed only selective impressions, reports of finely worked antler objects, durable garments suited to extreme climates, or metal tools whose origins lay far beyond the Mediterranean. Archaeological excavations in the Kola Peninsula and adjacent regions reveal a wide spectrum of utilitarian and ceremonial artifacts, including polished slate knives, bone harpoons, carved pendants, and ritual deposits placed near water sources. Radiocarbon sequences from these sites demonstrate the temporal depth of northern craftsmanship, indicating long-term continuity within regional traditions. Yet these empirical realities were reframed within Greek ethnography as signs of inherent harmony or ritual purity, reflecting interpretive patterns that drew symbolic rather than analytical connections. A sensory detail, the faint scrape of slate against stone during tool production, evokes the tactile world that remained inaccessible to Greek observers. The aesthetic logic underlying northern material culture frequently emphasized relationality between human communities and their environments. Petroglyphs depicting coordinated hunting scenes or boat processions reveal not only artistic intent, but also embedded knowledge of seasonal behavior, navigation routes, and ecological interdependence. Excavations at rock art sites in Norway and Finland indicate that such locations were repeatedly visited over millennia, suggesting ongoing cultural significance. Meanwhile, Greek conceptualizations of Hyperborea tended to flatten this complexity, interpreting northern landscapes through frameworks centered on idealized simplicity and ritual constancy. The contrast between ecological embeddedness and narrative abstraction highlights the methodological challenges inherent in aligning literary motifs with archaeological evidence. A conceptual reflection emerges. Imagined geographies often arise not from empirical absence, but from the interpretive transformation of distant realities into philosophically coherent forms. The limited Greek awareness of northern material culture was shaped not only by geographic separation, but also by the structure of maritime and overland exchange networks. Greek traders operating along the Black Sea engaged primarily with Scythian intermediaries, whose own interactions with northern populations involved selective acquisition rather than comprehensive cultural transmission. Archaeological finds in Scythian kurgans, including elaborate gold ornaments, weaponry, and imported Greek ceramics, reveal a complex interplay between local traditions and external influences. Although some northern objects, such as worked bone or amber ornaments, appear in these contexts, they represent only a fraction of the material diversity present in northern Eurasia. This selective incorporation reinforced Greek perceptions of northern regions as sources of rare and symbolically charged materials rather than as loci of diverse and dynamic cultural production. A conceptual reflection follows, where material exchange is mediated through elite or ritual filters. Receiving cultures often attribute idealized qualities to distant regions based on a narrow subset of artifacts. Greek literary traditions reinforced this selective idealization by framing Hyperborea not as a culturally specific society, but as a symbolic construct aligned with cosmological order. The aesthetic neutrality of Hyperborean imagery, neither richly described nor materially detailed, allowed Greek authors to use the motif as a conceptual counterbalance to the complexities of the Mediterranean world. This abstraction stands in contrast to the archaeological record, which reveals northern societies engaged in technological innovation, ceremonial elaboration, and adaptive strategies shaped by environmental variability. Yet it is precisely this abstraction that ensured Hyperborea's durability within Greek thought. Without concrete cultural attributes, the motif could absorb new symbolic meanings as intellectual and philosophical contexts evolved. A conceptual reflection underscores that cultural ideas gain longevity when they remain open to reinterpretation. allowing conceptual geographies like Hyperborea to persist across shifting historical paradigms. As the chapter draws to its transition, the cumulative analysis of northern material culture reveals that Greek authors constructed Hyperborea not from empirical observation, but from filtered impressions of distant craft traditions, environmental rhythms, and symbolic practices. The documentary now turns toward the next dimension of inquiry: how Greek navigation, geographic models, and experiential limits shaped the imaginative boundary at which Hyperborea was placed, forming the conceptual space examined in the following chapter. The geographical placement of Hyperborea within Greek thought cannot be understood apart from the navigational and observational limits that define the northern boundaries of the Mediterranean world in the archaic and classical periods. Greek seafaring expertise, though considerable within familiar coastal zones, remained constrained by environmental conditions that rendered high-latitude exploration both technically challenging and conceptually distant. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks, harbor installations, and nautical equipment, particularly from sites such as Kyrenia, Elonisos, and the southern Black Sea, reveals ship forms optimized for coastal cabotage rather than open ocean travel. Hull construction relied on mortise and tenon joinery suited to predictable Mediterranean currents, while rigging systems provided stability rather than the dynamic sail configurations required for Arctic or near-Arctic waters. Meanwhile, paleoclimatic reconstructions of North Atlantic conditions during the first millennium BCE indicate colder sea temperatures, stronger prevailing winds, and variable ice presence, factors that rendered northern exploration impractical for Mediterranean vessels. A sensory detail, the creak of timber responding to shifting swells, captures the embodied constraints that shaped Greek navigational horizons. Greek geographical models reflected these practical limits, revealing both an expanding curiosity and a persistent reliance on inherited schematic maps. Early cosmographers such as Hecataeus and Anaximander conceptualized the world as a disk or a series of concentric landmasses separated by ocean, with peripheral regions defined more by climatic theory than by empirical measurement. Archaeological surveys of Miletus and other centers of geographic inquiry show inscribed maps, measuring tools, and observational paraphernalia that underscore the intellectual ambition of Greek cartographers. Yet these tools were calibrated for Mediterranean latitudes. They lacked the capacity to incorporate information from regions where solar angles, magnetic variation, and seasonal rhythms diverged sharply from familiar patterns. Greek geographers therefore relied heavily on traveler accounts, many of which originated from intermediaries navigating the Pontic and steppe zones rather than the far north itself. A conceptual reflection arises. When empirical observation ends, conceptual geography emerges, often shaped as much by philosophical expectation as by distant testimony. The account of Pytheas of Massalia, who reportedly traveled northward in the late 4th century BCE, represents a significant though isolated attempt to push beyond established boundaries. His descriptions of Thule, a land where the sea, air, and earth merged into a gelatinous mixture, reflect conditions observed near polar latitudes during transitional seasons, when slush, fog, and shifting ice complicate environmental perception. Archaeological evidence from Massalia, including imported goods and inscriptions referencing northern trade, suggests that the city maintained economic and exploratory interests in Western Europe, providing a plausible context for Pytheas's voyage. However, Greek contemporaries doubted his reports, reflecting the gap between empirical exploration and prevailing conceptual frameworks. Paleoclimatic data from the Norwegian Sea confirm the presence of seasonal ice and variable sea states during the period of Pytheas's journey, lending credibility to his observations. Yet his account did not meaningfully alter the conceptual geography of Hyperborea. Instead, it existed alongside inherited narratives that placed the northern realm within a symbolic, not empirical, register. A conceptual reflection follows. Isolated acts of exploration rarely transform entrenched intellectual structures without sustained institutional integration. Greek navigational limitations also shaped perceptions of the northern interior, which could only be accessed indirectly through overland accounts transmitted by Scythians, Thracians, and other intermediaries. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological studies from settlements along the lower Dnieper and Don reveal exchange networks that extended into the forest steppe and taiga zones, providing material evidence for periodic contact between Mediterranean and northern communities. These networks, however, transporting goods rather than systematic geographic knowledge, leaving Greek authors to assemble sparse details into generalized descriptions of northern landscapes. Settlement archaeology across these intermediary regions indicates population mobility driven by climatic rhythms, economic opportunity, and socio-political dynamics, conditions that contributed to fragmented transmission of environmental information. A conceptual reflection underscores that ethnographic description suffers when transmission networks privilege objects over narratives, allowing symbolic interpretations to dominate conceptual geography. The limitations inherent in Greek geographic and navigational systems thus established the interpretive space within which Hyperborea could be situated at the conceptual boundary of the known world. As this section transitions, attention turns to how these limitations not only shaped geographic models, but also influenced the imaginative processes through which Greek authors reconciled empirical uncertainty with philosophical coherence, forming the intellectual backdrop for the elaboration of Hyperborea in classical thought. The conceptual boundaries established by Greek navigation and geographical reasoning influenced not only the perception of distant lands, but also the intellectual frameworks through which unfamiliar regions were classified and explained. Greek authors frequently interpreted environmental anomalies reported from the far north, extended daylight, seasonal darkness, unfamiliar animal distributions, through the lens of climatic theory rather than through empirical investigation. Aristotle's Meteorologica, though rooted in systematic observation, relied on generalized assumptions regarding the relationship between latitude, solar angle, and habitability. Archaeological surveys of Greek scientific centers, including the Lyceum and associated manuscript repositories, reveal texts and teaching materials emphasizing Mediterranean climatic norms. This intellectual environment made it difficult to integrate accounts from high latitudes into established models, reinforcing the perception of northern regions as liminal spaces beyond the predictable structure of the inhabited world. A sensory detail, the dim glow of oil lamps illuminating scrolls marked with schematic diagrams, captures the cognitive distance separating Greek geographers from the landscapes they sought to conceptualize. In this context, reports from travelers operating at the margins of Greek influence became subject to reinterpretation according to familiar narrative patterns. Merchants returning from the Black Sea, for example, relayed accounts obtained from Scythian and forest steppe populations, yet these accounts were shaped by variable translation, selective emphasis, and the narrative priorities of each intermediary. Archaeological evidence from trade posts along the lower Bug and Dnieper rivers, ceramics with mixed stylistic elements, imported amphora fragments, and metalworking debris illustrates the cosmopolitan character of these zones, where diverse cultural groups interacted without producing unified knowledge systems. Radiocarbon sequences from these sites demonstrate occupation patterns fluctuating with political and economic conditions, suggesting that the transmission of geographic information was episodic rather than continuous. Greek authors, confronted with fragmented or contradictory data, often resolved inconsistencies by appealing to mythic geography, situating remote regions within a conceptual framework governed by symbolic order rather than empirical detail. A conceptual reflection follows. When information flows intermittently across great distances, cultures tend to fill the gaps with structures of meaning already embedded within their intellectual traditions. The northern limit of Greek exploration was further constrained by the absence of direct inland expeditions comparable to those conducted in the Near East or Egypt. While Greek military and diplomatic activity extended across Anatolia, Syria, and northern Africa, the Eurasian forest zone remained largely inaccessible due to its dense vegetation, dispersed population groups, and lack of navigable waterways suitable for Mediterranean vessels. Archaeological studies of settlement patterns in the forest zone regions of the Volga, Oka interfluve reveal low-density habitation dispersed across vast territories, complicating any sustained contact with Mediterranean societies. Pollen core analyses from lakes in this region document thick forest cover during the first millennium BCE, reinforcing the environmental barriers that limited Greek exploration. As a result, northern territories were understood primarily through climatic inference and cosmological symbolism. Hyperborea emerged as a conceptual node within this intellectual architecture, a place beyond Boreas, the north wind, accessible not by navigation or overland travel, but by the structured imagination of Greek geographic thought. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that geographic voids often serve as sites for projecting cultural ideals, enabling Hyperborea to function as a marker of environmental and moral extremity. The intellectual strategies employed by Greek authors to reconcile navigational limits with expanding geographic curiosity further reinforced Hyperborea's symbolic position. Eratosthenes and later Hellenistic geographers attempted to refine world maps through mathematical calculation, using measurements of Earth's circumference and latitudinal distance to place peripheral regions within a more coherent spatial system. Archaeological evidence of astronomical instruments and engraved coordinate grids from this period demonstrates increasing sophistication in geographic reasoning. Yet the lack of direct observation meant that northern regions were plotted using extrapolation from climatic zones, producing abstractions rather than empirically grounded maps. Meanwhile, the persistence of older ethnographic motifs ensured that Hyperborea retained its association with ritual purity, longevity, and cosmic harmony, even as geographic models became more precise. A conceptual reflection follows. Intellectual refinement does not always eliminate mythic constructs. Instead, it can provide them with new epistemological scaffolding that stabilizes their place within evolving knowledge systems. The interplay of navigational constraints, fragmented information networks, and cosmological symbolism thus define the conceptual boundary where Hyperborea was situated. As this section transitions toward the chapter's final movement, attention will turn to how these limitations produced a dual vision of the North within Greek thought, one empirical, derived from reports of real landscapes, and one speculative, shaped by philosophical and literary traditions. The coexistence of these two visions underlies the durability of Hyperborea as a cultural construct. The dual vision of the northern world that emerged within Greek thought, one grounded in fragmented empirical observation, the other shaped by philosophical and poetic imagination, created the interpretive space within which Hyperborea could exist as both a conceptual boundary and an idealized cultural motif. Greek authors who engaged directly with reports from the Black Sea and neighboring regions encountered descriptions of landscapes marked by expansive rivers, extended winters, and migratory animal patterns, features supported by archaeological and environmental evidence. Sediment cores from the Dnieper and Don basins reveal periodic freezing, seasonal flooding, and long intervals of low light availability consistent with the environmental rhythms described by steppe intermediaries. Meanwhile, settlement excavations in the forest steppe zone demonstrate adaptive responses to these conditions. Semi-subterranean dwellings, storage pits, and toolkits designed for winter mobility. Such material correlates confirm the plausibility of environmental features embedded within distant accounts. However, Greek authors frequently subordinated these empirical elements to conceptual frameworks that presented the far north as a realm governed by cosmic order rather than ecological complexity. A sensory detail, the distant rumble of ice breaking upon a thawing river, captures an environmental experience that may have been transmitted indirectly, yet was ultimately transformed into symbolic narrative. This tension between empirical and conceptual geography is evident in the evolution of Greek cartographic traditions. Early schematic maps, dominated by circular or rectangular world plans, placed northern lands at the boundary of the oikoumene, the inhabited world. As geographic science advanced during the Hellenistic period, cartographers such as Eratosthenes introduced mathematical precision by integrating latitudinal measurements and climatic theory into world mapping. Archaeological evidence for such developments includes engraved coordinate grids on stone fragments and references to mapping tools preserved in later commentaries. Yet these refinements did little to clarify the nature of northern lands, which remained poorly documented and thus susceptible to symbolic elaboration. Greek maps positioned Hyperborea not in a fixed geographic location, but at the conceptual intersection of climatic extremity and philosophical idealization. A conceptual reflection underscores that cartography, particularly in its early stages, can reinforce rather than resolve mythic geography by embedding symbolic structures within spatial representations. The persistence of Hyperborea within Greek intellectual discourse also reflects broader cultural patterns of situating moral or cosmological ideals at the periphery of the known world. Comparative analysis reveals parallels with other ancient traditions that placed ideal societies or sacred origins at geographic extremes: eastward paradises in Near Eastern literature, remote mountain realms in Iranian tradition, or far western islands in Celtic myth. Archaeological surveys across these cultural regions show that boundary landscapes often held ritual significance, serving as metaphors for renewal, origin, or cosmic balance. Greek authors, operating within this wider interpretive field, projected their ideals onto the far north, framing Hyperborea as a place where environmental regularity, ritual propriety, and divine presence coexisted. This projection did not require empirical grounding. Rather, it drew its legitimacy from the conceptual logic of Greek cosmology, which understood the world as structured by directional forces, climatic gradients, and sacred geographies. A conceptual reflection emerges. Imagined peripheries serve as mirrors in which a culture perceives its aspirations, anxieties, and philosophical commitments. It is within this context that Hyperborea acquired its stability as an intellectual construct despite increasing Greek awareness of diverse northern populations. Ethnographic reports describing real communities, Sarmatians, Scythians, forest steppe foragers, were integrated into Greek texts, but rarely displaced the Hyperborean motif. Instead, empirical and symbolic geographies coexisted, each fulfilling different roles within the conceptual landscape of antiquity. Archaeological evidence from northern Eurasia, including settlement distributions, mortuary practices, and material traditions, reveals cultural dynamism inconsistent with Hyperborea's idealized stasis. Yet this mismatch strengthened rather than weakened the motif, allowing Hyperborea to remain insulated from empirical scrutiny. A conceptual reflection follows. Cultural constructs often persist precisely because they occupy conceptual domains distinct from empirical observation, enabling them to function as stable markers within intellectual systems even when contradicted by available evidence. As this chapter reaches its conclusion, the interplay between navigational limits, geographic models, and conceptual imagination becomes clear. Hyperborea emerged not from direct encounter, but from the intellectual structures that governed Greek interpretations of the unknown. The next chapter will examine how these interpretive structures evolved within classical and Hellenistic thought, transforming Hyperborea from a peripheral curiosity into a symbolically charged motif embedded within philosophical, poetic, and historiographical traditions. The intellectual transformation of Hyperborea during the classical period reflects the increasing sophistication of Greek philosophical, poetic, and historiographical discourse, which reinterpreted inherited mythic motifs within expanding systems of rational inquiry. As Greek thinkers sought to reconcile traditional cosmologies with emerging empirical frameworks, Hyperborea shifted from a peripheral geographical curiosity to a conceptual locus where environmental theory, ethical speculation, and ritual symbolism converged. Literary analysis of Pindar's odes reveals that early references to Hyperborea were embedded within a program of moral exemplarity, using the northern realm as a narrative device to emphasize themes of purity, divine favor, and ritual continuity. Archaeological evidence from contemporaneous sanctuaries, particularly Delos and Delphi, shows increased circulation of imported votive objects during this period, indicating an expanding religious imagination that accommodated distant or symbolic geographies. A sensory detail, the faint crackle of incense rising during festival rites, captures the ceremonial atmosphere in which such conceptual expansions occurred. Herodotus played a pivotal role in transforming Hyperborea from a poetic abstraction into a subject of historiographical negotiation. His inquiries into the veracity of Hyperborean offerings and northern ethnographies reveal an effort to apply empirical scrutiny while acknowledging the limitations imposed by geographical remoteness. Excavations along the Black Sea coast, where Greek communities interacted with Scythian and forest steppe populations, provide material confirmation of the intercultural encounters Herodotus describes. Pottery assemblages, weapon fragments, and trade goods uncovered at sites such as Olbia indicate robust exchange networks that facilitated the movement of information, albeit in fragmented form. Yet Herodotus' interpretive method reveals a tension between skepticism and acceptance. While he questions implausible details, he preserves the Hyperborean motif as part of a broader ethnographic tapestry. A conceptual reflection underscores this dynamic. Historiography often negotiates between empirical constraint and narrative inheritance, producing accounts that both challenge and sustain traditional motifs. Classical philosophers, particularly those concerned with natural science and cosmology, transformed Hyperborea further by integrating it into climatic and ethical theory. In the Meteorologica, Aristotle outlined a systematic division of the inhabited world into climatic zones, identifying regions beyond the temperate belt as marginal or extreme. Although he does not reference Hyperborea explicitly, his framework provided intellectual scaffolding for later writers who sought to situate the northern realm within a rationalized cosmology. Paleoclimatic reconstructions from ice core and sediment analyses support the existence of pronounced environmental gradients across Eurasia during the first millennium BCE, aligning with the climatic distinctions outlined by Aristotle and his successors. These scientific insights, however, did not diminish the symbolic potency of Hyperborea. Instead, they reinforced its position as an idealized zone where environmental stability and cosmic order converged. A conceptual reflection follows. Mythic motifs endure when they can be harmonized with scientific frameworks, allowing them to persist as metaphorical expressions of theoretical principles. The classical period also witnessed the incorporation of Hyperborea into broader discourses on virtue and societal organization. Philosophers exploring the relationship between environment and moral character, most notably within the Hippocratic corpus, posited that climatic conditions shaped human dispositions and cultural development. Hyperborea, situated at the northern limit of the habitable world, became a conceptual test case for examining the effects of extreme environmental conditions on societal harmony. Archaeological evidence from northern Eurasian settlements, including the distribution of pit houses, fishing gear, and seasonal toolkits, demonstrates adaptive responses to environmental stress rather than the static harmony attributed to Hyperboreans. Yet Greek authors interpreted northern lifestyles through idealizing frameworks that emphasized moderation, ritual propriety, and longevity. A conceptual reflection highlights the interpretive process by which empirical difference becomes moralized difference, allowing Hyperborea to function as a symbolic counterpart to Mediterranean social dynamics. As Greek intellectual culture expanded through increased literacy, manuscript circulation, and the institutionalization of philosophical schools, Hyperborea transitioned from an isolated ethnographic motif to a recurring element within diverse genres. Tragedy, lyric poetry, historical prose, and philosophical treatises all employed the northern realm as a structural device, revealing its adaptability across varying discursive contexts. Archaeological findings from Athenian and Ionian educational sites, wax tablets, inscribed ostraka, and manuscript fragments attest to the circulation of ethnographic and cosmographical materials that informed these literary developments. The chapter turns toward its next movement by recognizing that Hyperborea's transformation during the classical era set the stage for its further elaboration in Hellenistic scholarship, where systematization and synthesis became defining intellectual strategies. The Hellenistic period marked a decisive phase in the intellectual evolution of Hyperborea, as scholars sought to synthesize inherited myths, empirical observations, and increasingly sophisticated geographic theories into cohesive explanatory frameworks. The rise of major scholarly centers, Alexandria, Pergamon, and Rhodes, facilitated the collection, comparison, and critical evaluation of texts, enabling scholars to reinterpret earlier poetic and ethnographic accounts. In this environment, Hyperborea shifted from a peripheral mythic region into a structural component of cosmological geography, positioned within systems that attempted to map the world using longitudinal and latitudinal principles. Archaeological evidence from Alexandria's library complex, including inscribed ostraka, styluses, and fragmentary catalogue lists, reflects the intensity of scholarly activity dedicated to reconciling disparate sources. A sensory detail, the dry rustle of papyrus as scholars turned sheets of copied texts, evokes the atmosphere in which Hyperborea underwent its intellectual reconfiguration. Diodorus Siculus illustrates this Hellenistic synthesis by merging earlier poetic descriptions with contemporary geographic reasoning. His placement of Hyperborea near the Riphean Mountains reflects an attempt to anchor the motif within a speculative yet structured topography. Geological surveys of the Ural Range, which ancient writers sometimes associated with the Riphean Mountains, reveal extensive mineral deposits, long-term habitation, and evidence of metallurgical activity dating back to the Bronze Age. While these empirical features bear no direct relation to Hyperborea as conceived by Greek authors, they provided a plausible geographic reference point that allowed mythic narratives to be integrated into evolving cartographic models. Radiocarbon sequences from surrounding regions confirm dense cultural layering across millennia, suggesting the existence of well-developed societies that remained outside direct Mediterranean perception. A conceptual reflection follows. Intellectual systems often stabilize mythic constructs by situating them within concrete yet distant landscapes, granting them geographic credibility without requiring historical substantiation. Hellenistic scholarship also reinforced the symbolic association between Hyperborea and celestial order. Advances in astronomy, particularly those attributed to Hipparchus and Eratosthenes, deepened Greek awareness of the axial tilt of the Earth and its implications for seasonal variation across latitudes. These scientific developments offered an explanatory framework for the extraordinary light cycles reported from the far north, allowing Hyperborea to be interpreted as a region where celestial mechanics manifested in exaggerated and therefore symbolically potent forms. Archaeological investigations of Hellenistic astronomical instruments, including armillary spheres and gnomon calibrations found in Rhodes and Delos, reveal the precision with which scholars measured shadow lengths and solar angles, integrating mathematical rigor into cosmological speculation. Yet even as scientific accuracy increased, Hyperborea retained its role as a realm of ritual harmony and exceptional well-being. A conceptual reflection underscores this duality. Scientific refinement can coexist with mythic idealization when both serve complementary functions within an intellectual tradition. The textual transmission of Hyperborean narratives during the Hellenistic period contributed significantly to the motif's endurance. Manuscript culture facilitated the copying, editing, and commentary of earlier works, ensuring that references to Hyperborea circulated widely among scholars and literate elites. Archaeological evidence from Hellenistic educational contexts, scribe tools, school exercises, and annotated papyri fragments attests to the pedagogical use of geographic and ethnographic texts. These materials reveal that Hyperborea functioned not merely as a mythic locale, but as a conceptual case study in discussions about the limits of human habitation, the structure of the cosmos, and the symbolic orientation of ritual practice. As such, its meaning expanded beyond narrative to become an intellectual category embedded within broader philosophical discourse. A conceptual reflection arises when a cultural motif becomes entangled with educational structures. Its persistence is ensured not by empirical accuracy, but by its utility in framing conceptual arguments. The Hellenistic rearticulation of Hyperborea also reflected shifting political contexts. As Greek influence spread through Alexander's campaigns and subsequent successor kingdoms, the geographic horizon of the Mediterranean world expanded dramatically. Yet these expansions occurred primarily eastward and southward, leaving the northern periphery conceptually stable. Hyperborea thus remained a symbolic constant in a rapidly changing intellectual landscape, offering a point of orientation that contrasted with the unstable political and cultural boundaries of the Hellenistic world. Archaeological evidence from royal libraries and palace complexes, particularly in Pergamon, demonstrates the centrality of myth, geography, and ethnography in articulating dynastic identity and cosmological legitimacy. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that imagined geographies often function as ideological anchors during periods of rapid expansion, enabling stable narratives to coexist alongside shifting empirical knowledge. As this section approaches its transition, the synthesis of empirical, poetic, philosophical, and cartographic traditions reveals how Hyperborea evolved into a multi-layered intellectual construct during the Hellenistic period. The next section will examine how these layers interacted over time, solidifying Hyperborea's place not only within Greek thought, but within the broader conceptual heritage of antiquity. The durability of Hyperborea within Greek intellectual history owes much to the cumulative layering of interpretations that accrued as the motif migrated across genres, disciplines, and philosophical agendas. By the late Hellenistic era, Hyperborea had come to represent more than a distant northern land. It functioned as a conceptual coordinate within broader debates on cosmology, ritual continuity, moral order, and the spatial organization of the inhabited world. Textual evidence from scholia on Pindar, commentaries on Herodotus, and fragments preserved in later compendia demonstrates that ancient scholars frequently engaged with the motif as a site of intellectual negotiation, weighing poetic inheritance against geographic speculation. Archaeological discoveries of manuscript fragments from Oxyrhynchus and other Hellenistic centers reveal marginal notes indicating attempts to reconcile the various Hyperborean traditions, suggesting that readers recognized the internal inconsistencies of the motif even as they preserved it. A sensory detail, the faint scratch of a reed pen annotating a papyrus margin, captures the scholarly process through which Hyperborea continued to evolve. The shifting interpretive landscape of the late Hellenistic period encouraged a more systematic approach to reconciling mythic geography with empirical inquiry. Scholars working in Alexandria and Pergamon attempted to refine world maps through cross-referencing earlier cartographic traditions with new astronomical measurements. Yet the absence of first-hand observation of northern regions ensured that Hyperborea remained an abstraction shaped by intellectual rather than empirical criteria. Geological and archaeological studies in regions associated with the speculative placement of Hyperborea, particularly the Ural Mountains and adjacent forest steppe, demonstrate a diversity of cultural practices, including metallurgical production, complex burial rites, and long-term settlement continuity. Radiocarbon sequences from these areas show cultural dynamism inconsistent with the static idealization found in Greek texts. Nevertheless, the motif persisted because it fulfilled conceptual roles that empirical accuracy could not replace. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that mythic constructs endure when they provide explanatory value within intellectual systems, even if they diverge from archaeological evidence. As philosophical schools diversified, Hyperborea acquired additional interpretive functions. Stoic thinkers, emphasizing the unity of the cosmos and the rational structure of natural law, interpreted Hyperborea as a symbolic embodiment of environmental harmony, a region where cosmic rhythm manifested without disruption. Meanwhile, later Platonists treated the motif as an allegorical representation of ideal political or moral order, aligning Hyperborea with conceptual spaces free of corruption or decay. Archaeological evidence from ritual and educational sites in Athens and Rhodes, ceremonial vessels, inscribed tablets, and architectural remains indicates that philosophical instruction frequently incorporated geographic and cosmological topics, suggesting that Hyperborea may have served as an illustrative example in discussions about the limits of the knowable world. A conceptual reflection follows. When mythic geography becomes embedded in philosophical discourse, it acquires a structural role that supersedes its descriptive origins. Hellenistic literature also contributed to the transformation of the Hyperborean idea by integrating it into new narrative contexts. Poets and historians alike employed the motif to explore themes of travel, exile, and divine presence. Although these texts seldom engaged with empirical descriptions of northern landscapes, their use of Hyperborea reinforced its symbolic significance as a place situated beyond ordinary experience. Archaeological evidence from literary production centers, inkwells, styluses, and manuscript fragments suggests that authors operated within institutions where the interplay between inherited tradition and contemporary inquiry shaped literary experimentation. Within such environments, Hyperborea's adaptability made it an attractive motif for exploring human encounters with the unknown. A conceptual reflection underscores that mythic spaces retain relevance when they can accommodate multiple interpretive functions across temporal and disciplinary boundaries. By the end of the Hellenistic period, Hyperborea had become deeply entrenched within the conceptual geography of antiquity. It functioned as a symbolic marker of the northern limit of the world, a site of ritual origin, a philosophical exemplar, and a poetic abstraction. Archaeological and textual evidence alike illustrate that Hyperborea's persistence resulted not from empirical verification, but from its capacity to absorb and organize diverse strands of Greek intellectual tradition. As this chapter concludes, the narrative transitions toward its final movement, an examination of Hyperborea's legacy within later antiquity and the broader cultural landscape, exploring how the motif continued to shape and be shaped by interpretive frameworks beyond the classical world. By the closing centuries of antiquity, Hyperborea had come to represent not a geographic claim, but a conceptual archetype embedded within the intellectual architecture of the Greek and later Roman worlds. Its persistence across centuries reflects the capacity of imagined geographies to outlast the conditions that first inspired them, transitioning from ethnographic speculation into durable components of cultural memory. Literary works of the Roman period, including those of Pausanias and Aelian, preserve fragments of the Hyperborean motif, though often stripped of their earlier cosmological complexity. Archaeological evidence from Roman-era libraries, charred papyri, inscribed book lists, and architectural remains from sites such as Herculaneum illustrates that Greek ethnographic and cosmographical texts continued to circulate widely, ensuring the transmission of Hyperborean narratives well into the imperial period. A sensory detail, the crisp sound of parchment turning in a quiet scriptorium, evokes the contemplative environment in which these inherited stories were preserved and reinterpreted. The endurance of Hyperborea in late antiquity owes much to its malleability within shifting intellectual frameworks. Stoic writers employed the motif as a metaphor for cosmic alignment, interpreting Hyperborea as a region where natural law expressed itself with exceptional clarity. Meanwhile, Neoplatonists drew upon earlier symbolic readings to frame the northern realm as an allegory for spiritual elevation or philosophical detachment. These interpretations, though divergent in thematic emphasis, shared a reliance on Hyperborea's conceptual distance from the complexities of Mediterranean life. Archaeological studies of philosophical schools, architectural remains from Athens, epigraphic records from Rhodes, and sculptural fragments from Alexandria demonstrate that philosophical instruction frequently engaged with cosmological geography, reinforcing Hyperborea's role as a pedagogical tool. A conceptual reflection follows. Cultural motifs achieve longevity when they remain adaptable to new intellectual paradigms while preserving the symbolic functions that made them compelling in earlier periods. Hyperborea's legacy is also visible in late antique geographical discourse, where scholars attempted to reconcile classical narratives with emerging models of global mapping. Ptolemaic geography, though primarily empirical, retained the conceptual boundaries inherited from earlier Greek thought, situating speculative northern regions within a mathematical grid that transformed mythical space into abstract coordinates. Manuscript evidence of Ptolemy's Geographia, including medieval copies containing marginal illustrations and schematic maps, reveals that Hyperborea's conceptual imprint persisted even when stripped of narrative detail. While no archaeological evidence suggests that Roman or late antique explorers approached the Arctic Circle, the motif continued to define the imaginative frontier of the known world. A conceptual reflection highlights that the cartographic absorption of mythic geography does not eliminate its symbolic force. Instead, it codifies its place within intellectual systems that blend empirical observation with conceptual inheritance. The transition of Hyperborea from a Greek to a broader Mediterranean cultural construct reflects its capacity to articulate shared concerns about the limits of human knowledge and the structure of the cosmos. Roman authors frequently employed Hyperborea as a rhetorical device, invoking it to emphasize remoteness or to illustrate the extremes of environmental or moral conditions. Archaeological evidence from Roman religious sites, altars, dedicatory inscriptions, and imported votive objects demonstrates continued interest in distant or exotic origins for ritual materials, though not necessarily linked to Hyperborean traditions. Yet the symbolic function of placing ritual or moral exemplars at the boundaries of the world remained a consistent feature of Mediterranean thought. A conceptual reflection underscores that imagined geographies serve not merely descriptive roles, but conceptual ones, marking the intersection between empirical limits and intellectual aspirations. By late antiquity, Hyperborea had acquired a dual legacy, as a repository of archaic Greek cosmology and as a flexible symbol capable of adaptation within new cultural contexts. The archaeological and textual evidence considered throughout this documentary demonstrates that Hyperborea's endurance was not tied to factual credibility, but to its interpretive utility. As environmental knowledge expanded and geographic horizons broadened, the motif persisted because it functioned as a conceptual threshold, an intellectual boundary marking the edge of the known world and the beginning of speculative space. A final conceptual reflection emerges. Cultures preserve imagined landscapes when they offer frameworks for thinking about the structure of reality, the limits of human experience, and the enduring relationship between the known and the unknowable. The chapter now moves toward its concluding sections, where Hyperborea's long-term influence, from medieval cosmologies to modern scholarly interpretations, will be examined to clarify how this ancient conceptual geography continues to shape contemporary understandings of myth, memory, and the northern world. The afterlife of Hyperborea in medieval intellectual traditions illustrates how ancient conceptual geographies can persist long after their original cultural frameworks have dissolved. As Greek and Roman texts circulated through Byzantine scriptoria and early medieval scholarly centers, Hyperborea was preserved less for its ethnographic content than for its symbolic position within a cosmological order inherited from antiquity. Manuscript evidence from monastic libraries, palimpsests bearing faint traces of classical geographical treatises, marginal glosses identifying distant lands, and compendia that integrated biblical, classical, and local traditions, reveals the layered transmission through which Hyperborean motifs endured. Although medieval scholars often placed greater emphasis on scriptural geography, they retained fragments of the ancient northern boundary as part of a larger inherited worldview. A sensory detail, the low murmur of monks reciting texts in a stone-walled scriptorium, conjures the quiet continuity through which classical ideas were carried forward. During the medieval period, Hyperborea became increasingly decoupled from its original Greek cosmology and absorbed into broader theories of world structure, often appearing in marginal spaces of mappamundi, medieval world maps that blended empirical knowledge with theological symbolism. Archaeological studies of European manuscript workshops, including pigment analyses and radiocarbon dating of parchment, demonstrate the meticulous craftsmanship with which these maps were produced. Within them, northern regions frequently appeared as zones of marvels or anomalies, echoing the conceptual role Hyperborea once held in Greek thought. Although medieval cartographers no longer reference Hyperborea explicitly, the idea of a remote northern realm marked by unusual environmental conditions persisted, illustrating how mythic geographies can survive through conceptual substitution rather than direct continuity. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that intellectual inheritance often operates through structural patterns rather than explicit citations, allowing ancient motifs to shape later frameworks even when their names disappear. Renaissance humanism brought renewed attention to classical texts, reintroducing Hyperborea into scholarly discourse through philological study and the revival of ancient cosmography. Archaeological recovery of Greek manuscripts in Italian libraries, attested by catalogue inventories, binding fragments, and marginal annotations allowed early modern scholars to reconstruct previously obscure references to Hyperborea. This revival coincided with increased European exploration of northern latitudes, including encounters with Arctic environments that revealed environmental phenomena, extended daylight, auroral displays, bearing superficial resemblance to ancient descriptions. Although early modern scholars did not equate Hyperborea with any newly encountered land, the convergence of textual revival and empirical discovery reinforced European fascination with the far north as a region of environmental extremity and conceptual otherness. A conceptual reflection arises when renewed empirical inquiry intersects with revived textual tradition. The imagined geographies of antiquity can acquire fresh interpretive energy. In the modern period, Hyperborea has been subject to extensive scholarly scrutiny, particularly within fields concerned with Indo-European mythology, comparative religion, and the history of ancient geography. Archaeological advances across northern Eurasia, from large-scale excavations of Mesolithic settlements to high-resolution paleoclimatic reconstructions, have clarified the environmental and cultural contexts that ancient Greek authors could not have perceived. Radiocarbon dating, stable isotope analysis, and ancient DNA research have revealed complex demographic patterns, subsistence strategies, and technological developments that stand in contrast to the idealized depictions of Hyperborea preserved in classical texts. Yet modern scholarship recognizes the value of Hyperborea not as a historical civilization, but as a lens through which to examine the cognitive structures underlying ancient ethnography and cosmology. A conceptual reflection underscores that understanding mythic geography provides insight into the intellectual mechanisms by which societies organize unfamiliar spaces, transforming empirical uncertainty into symbolic coherence. Hyperborea's modern legacy extends beyond academic inquiry into popular culture, where it often appears in speculative narratives, esoteric traditions, and alternative historical theories. While these appropriations frequently depart from the rigorous interpretive standards applied in classical scholarship, they reflect the motif's enduring capacity to evoke the allure of remote landscapes and the imagined perfection of distant societies. Archaeological and textual evidence offers no support for such reconstructions, yet their persistence highlights the enduring human tendency to situate idealized communities at the edge of the known world. A conceptual reflection follows. Imagined geographies thrive when they offer cognitive resolution to enduring questions about origin, order, and the limits of human experience. As this section transitions toward the concluding movement of the chapter, the cumulative analysis reveals that Hyperborea's longevity results not from empirical grounding, but from its flexibility as a conceptual boundary, an intellectual artifact capable of adaptation across shifting cultural contexts. The final section will synthesize these insights, articulating Hyperborea's enduring relevance as a case study in the history of ideas, the anthropology of myth, and the archaeology of conceptual space. The cumulative legacy of Hyperborea illustrates how imagined geographies serve as durable intellectual structures, enabling societies to articulate boundaries between the known and the unknown, the empirical and the symbolic, the historical and the mythic. Throughout antiquity, Hyperborea persisted not because it corresponded to any identifiable archaeological culture or verifiable location, but because it functioned as a conceptual threshold, an interpretive space where Greek thinkers could explore questions of environmental determinism, ritual continuity, and cosmic order. Archaeological studies across northern Eurasia, encompassing settlement patterns, mortuary practices, subsistence strategies, and artistic traditions, reveal societies shaped by ecological adaptation and cultural dynamism, offering no parallel to the static harmony attributed to the Hyperboreans. Yet the disjunction between material evidence and literary construction is central to understanding Hyperborea's intellectual significance. A sensory detail, the quiet drift of snow across an empty tundra, captures the atmospheric isolation that ancient observers projected onto distant landscapes, transforming them into canvases for conceptual elaboration. Hyperborea's endurance underscores the cognitive processes by which cultures render remote spaces intelligible. Greek ethnographic thought, constrained by limited geographic knowledge and dependent on fragmentary transmissions from intermediaries, reshaped distant realities into symbolic patterns aligned with local cosmologies. Classical philosophers integrated these patterns into theories of climate and virtue, while Hellenistic scholars embedded them within increasingly sophisticated cartographic and astronomical systems. Archaeological evidence, from votive assemblages at Delos to cosmographical manuscripts in Alexandria, demonstrates that these interpretive frameworks operated within institutional contexts that reinforced the stability of inherited motifs. A conceptual reflection follows. The durability of imagined landscapes arises from their ability to absorb new data without relinquishing their foundational structure, allowing them to function as cognitive anchors across generations. The transformation of Hyperborea across time also reveals the reciprocal relationship between empirical observation and symbolic interpretation. Reports from travelers such as Pythias introduced details of high-latitude environments, gelatinous seas, extended twilight seasonal extremes that aligned imperfectly with earlier poetic descriptions, yet were accommodated within existing conceptual frameworks. Greek geographic thought, shaped by both curiosity and doctrinal continuity, reconciled these anomalies by assigning Hyperborea a place within an expanded cosmology rather than dismissing the motif altogether. This adaptability is documented in textual commentaries, where scholars attempted to reconcile disparate traditions by appealing to climatic gradients or astronomical principles. A conceptual reflection emphasizes that intellectual systems remain robust when they allow symbolic categories to coexist with empirical uncertainty, enabling motifs like Hyperborea to persist even in the face of contradictory evidence. In later antiquity and beyond, Hyperborea's legacy became detached from its classical context, evolving into a generalized symbol of northern otherness. Medieval scholars incorporated fragments of the motif into theological worldviews, Renaissance humanists revisited it through philological study, and modern interpreters, scholarly and popular alike, have continued to explore its significance as a cultural artifact rather than a historical entity. Archaeological advances across northern Eurasia have clarified the diversity and complexity of real societies once imagined through the Hyperborean lens, underscoring the methodological importance of distinguishing between symbolic geography and material culture. Yet the motif's persistence reveals that imagined geographies offer enduring frameworks for exploring human cognition, cultural memory, and the interpretive structures through which societies map the boundaries of the world. A conceptual reflection arises. When mythic constructs illuminate the limitations of ancient knowledge systems, they also reveal the intellectual creativity with which cultures navigate uncertainty. In synthesizing the environmental, archaeological, linguistic, ritual, and philosophical dimensions traced throughout this study, Hyperborea emerges as a case example of the intersection between empirical data and conceptual imagination. Its significance resides not in factual existence, but in its capacity to articulate the limits of ancient geographical comprehension, the dynamics of cultural transmission, and the symbolic grammar of Greek cosmology. As Hyperborea recedes into the conceptual horizon of antiquity, its legacy persists as a reminder that the boundaries of the known world are never fixed, but continually reshaped by the interplay between observation, interpretation, and the enduring human impulse to situate meaning at the edges of experience.